In Cincinnati, Ohio, 18-year-old Annishia Smith falls hard for a handsome man with a shady past.
He was older, he was exciting, he gave her a lot of attention.
But her new boyfriend uses her sexual prowess to his advantage.
Her man wanted money, and she was willing to do what she needed to do to get it for him.
And their get-rich-quick scheme quickly spirals out of control.
Love can be blind, and love can be foolish, and love can make you do crazy things.
And later, in Dallas, Pennsylvania, suburban wife and mother of 3, Tina Young, finds herself stuck in a rut with dreams of escape.
Simply put, there's no excitement in her life anymore.
But her new addiction becomes a lethal obsession, and she will stop at nothing to get it.
Tina's simple and easy plan turned into one with a deadly ending.
In Cincinnati, Ohio, 17-year-old Annishia Smith appears to be a typical high school senior.
Annishia was a good student, and she was very close to her family. She was very close to her sisters. She adored her sisters.
But there's one thing that sets her apart from her classmates.
She also had one child and was a good mother to that child.
With the help of her own mother, the teen mom is able to juggle all of her responsibilities with ease.
Annishia was very focused. Even though she had a child young, she was working hard in school, she had a job, and she also started a nonprofit organization to empower other teen moms and help little kids.
And on the busy mom's 18th birthday, she and her friends celebrate with a night out at the bowling alley.
They're all having a good time, but at some point, she ends up meeting this tough guy, and something about him drew her to him.
22-year-old David Bell has caught the eye of most of the young women at the bowling alley. Annishia and her crew aren't familiar with the new guy, as he's been away doing a year-long stint behind bars.
She didn't seem to be fazed at the fact that David was in prison.
David had a prior criminal history. He was charged and convicted of bank robbery.
What Annishia saw was a tall, attractive young man. Got braids, got tattoos. Bad guys can be attractive, and that was part of the appeal.
Although the teenager knows David is forbidden fruit, she still wants to take a bite.
Most young women Annishia's age get caught up in this idea of being with the most popular kid. They're much more attracted to the bad boy. David had street smarts and a bravado that was very appealing to her.
Even though David's still fresh out of prison, he's in no hurry to change his ways.
I don't think he really ever had a legit job.
His dangerous life did not bother Annishia. They hit it off great when they're at the bowling alley and became inseparable. And their relationship really continued to blossom.
Over the next few weeks, things move fast for the young couple. And it becomes clear to David that Annishia has a bit of an edge, too. And soon, his dark world starts to creep into his new girlfriend's life.
David started to include Annishia in some illegal activity.
The impressionable young teenager quickly agrees because she doesn't want to lose her man. Plus, she's intrigued.
David was grooming Annishia for his own needs, and Annishia was tired of following the straight and narrow and was willing to do anything that he asked in order to be his girlfriend.
The ex-con takes his girl under his wing, and he has high hopes for his lady.
David's plan was to use Annishia to seduce men and put them in vulnerable positions, and then he would come in and rob them.
He doesn't mind that his girl will be with other men, and Annishia is down for anything.
David approved of her behavior as long as he was getting something out of it.
Annishia was willing to do anything for her man, and he knew it.
Annishia was being manipulated and didn't even realize it.
David didn't really love this young woman. He was using her. No man who truly loves a woman would put her in a situation of sharing her body with some other man.
A few days later, the couple are out one night when they spot what could be their first mark.
Annishia and David's first victim is Corey Frederick.
She can tell by his bling that he's not hurting for cash. And Corey can't take his eyes off the teenaged femme fatale.
Annishia was the light. She dressed sexy. She came onto these guys, And when these guys were attracted to her bright light, David Bell was waiting in the darkness.
After a long night of flirting, they agreed to meet up for a proper date. David and Annishia's scheme is officially on. A week later, Corey arrives at her place to pick her up for their date. But things heat up quickly, and their dinner reservations are put on hold. David is close by, waiting patiently for updates.
While Corey and Annishia are having a good time, she's busy texting David. She's keeping him in the loop as to how this date is going.
Then Annishia makes a startling discovery.
You scared?
Oh, no.
No?
Yeah, just give me 1 second.
She lets David know that Corey is armed with a gun.
David and his girl text back and forth and plot out a way to handle the situation.
The plan developed that Annishia would get Corey into the shower for the two of them to have sex. And in doing so, he had to take off his clothes and leave his handgun in the bedroom.
Corey was attracted to Annishia, and he ended up getting very lucky that night.
David sneaks into the apartment, and Anishia's date's luck is about to run out.
When Corey and Annishia come out of the bathroom, David's standing right there.
Where's the money at?
And he's pointing Corey's own gun at him.
You don't got no money?
In Cincinnati, Ohio, Annishia Smith and her new beau, David Bell, are in the middle of their underhanded scheme. She lures them in, and he robs them. And their first victim is feeling their sting.
Calm down. Where's the money at?
Corey comes out of the bathroom. He's half naked with a towel wrapped around him.
Sit down.
There's David holding Corey's own handgun, aiming it at his head, threatening to kill him.
Do you want to die today?
David demands his cell phone and his wallet, and Corey can't do anything.
Corey hands over all of his stuff, and his attacker takes off. As soon as he's gone, Annishia lets the crocodile tears flow. Little does he know, she's pretending to be a victim, and Corey's buying her act.
Corey called the police because the weapon was taken, and Corey, I think, felt that if that weapon were ever used in a crime, that could be somehow used against him.
And when Annishia is questioned, she starts spinning lies.
Annishia tells the officers that the suspect was an ex-boyfriend named Josh.
His name is Josh.
She misled them as to his height, his weight, his physical characteristics, said she really didn't know how to get in touch with him, and gave a lot of just vague and improper answers. That investigation went nowhere, and it was an unsolved crime.
Needless to say, the couple's first date is also their last. And Anishia's first foray into crime is successful.
In some ways, she felt that perhaps she was really proving her worth being in a relationship with David. As long as her man was continuing to see her as an asset, she was happy. But the question was, for how long?
So after the incident, Annishia and David felt like they got away with it, and it seemed like things were going great.
Annishia is now feeling more confident because they got away with the first robbery. They're starting to aim higher to get away with even more. And she feels that their bond was getting stronger, so she thought that no one else was going to get in their way.
The couple lays low for a bit, but soon enough, the lovers are ready to strike again.
So a couple months had gone by, and this was an opportunity to get back out there and make some money.
The teen temptress is back out at the nightclub when she meets her next conquest, drug dealer Peter Koppel.
They meet, and she turned on the charm.
Annishia works her game, and pretty soon, Peter starts to brag about his nice crib.
So Peter kind of paints this picture to Annishia that his house is filled with a lot of expensive items, like TVs, a game system, electronics.
And later that night, when Annishia gets her tab, the high roller picks it up.
At that point, she notices that he has a lot of cash.
They exchange numbers, and the trap is set. Later that night, she tells her man they might have just hit the jackpot.
Between Peter having money and Peter possibly being involved in drug sales, that rang some bells in David's head, and figured he'd be an easy victim.
With the potential for a big payday, the couple decide to take their scheme to the dealer. The next day, Annishia flirts with Peter on the phone. She lays it on thick and tells him that she wants to see him. The dealer takes the bait.
He invited her to his house to hang out.
The plan was to send Annishia into Peter's house, kind of like with the other gentleman, with Corey. Get in there, do what you have to do.
David.
It's over.
That night around 11 p.m., David gives her a ride to the dealer's place. He pulls over a few blocks away, gives his girl one last kiss, and sends her on her way.
Once Annishia gets to the house, she discovers that Peter's two roommates, Charles and Drew, are there.
I'm here for Peter.
Yeah, Peter's upstairs.
She's concerned about how this is going to affect their plan, so she texts David to let him know.
But her man tells her not to worry.
David's response is, "Don't trip, they're going to die."
With David texting Annishia that he's planning on killing someone, that should have been the time for her to step up and say something, but she did nothing. In essence, she had put her man's needs before her own.
Hey.
Hey, what's up?
How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good.
Annishia gets to Peter's room, they watch movies, they talk, and they end up having sex.
When the new lovers are finished, Annishia knows she needs to get rid of him. So she sends Peter out to get them some drinks.
He asked Annishia if she wanted to go with him. She declined.
So once Peter leaves, Annishia texts David and lets him know that the coast is clear. But the two roommates are still in the house.
Once again, he coldly tells her exactly what he's going to do.
David says, "You're going to hear 2 shots. That's going to be me killing his brothers."
Well aware of what's about to go down, Annishia lets David in the house.
When it came to her man, Annishia didn't care about anything or anyone else.
She was blinded and controlled by him.
Once inside, he hunts down his prey.
It was after midnight, and the 2 roommates went to their own rooms and were sleeping.
Annishia watches as her man heads upstairs. And seconds later, in Dallas, Pennsylvania, Tina Young has a deadly midlife crisis when she falls out of love with her husband and in love with a drug dealer.
The thrill of something new was what ultimately led her down this path.
Someone will pay the price for her dangerous addiction.
Cincinnati, Ohio. 18-year-old Annishia Smith and her boyfriend David Bell are about to rob the house of flashy drug dealer Peter Koppel. Peter has stepped out, but his 2 roommates are still in their rooms.
David enters Charles' room first, and Charles is sleeping, listening to music.
David just pointed the gun within a couple feet of the back of his head, fired 1 shot, and executes the victim.
1 shot, and Charles is dead.
After David executes Charles, Drew had thought he heard some noise, but the house is so big that he wasn't quite sure.
So David heads to Drew's room, but Drew ended up being awake.
And as he turned his head, he was confronted by David standing over him with a gun.
This time, David isn't so lucky. Drew drops to the ground.
He fired a shot at him and missed. Instead of hitting him in the head, he shot him in the shoulder.
David fired a number of shots at Drew, so the gun was basically emptied.
After the barrage of bullets, Drew is wounded but alive.
Even though he wanted to finish the job, he had no more bullets.
And David said to Drew at that time,
"Lay down and die already."
Satisfied he's not going to get in their way, David calls out to his girl.
Annishia.
But she's nowhere to be found.
The gunfire spooked Annishia out, and so she left the house and ran to her car where she hid.
Where you going? Get out the car.
David finds her and demands that she return to the home with him so that they could rob the place. Annishia really didn't want to go back to that house, but after seeing the look in David's eyes, she decided to comply.
Okay.
After she heard that gunshot, Annishia knew that he followed through with what he said he was going to do, and there was just no turning back. Now she had to move forward with the plan and finish the job.
Calm down, calm down.
The couple knows they have to hurry. Peter could be home at any minute, and the police might be on their way. They grab the first few items they see and run for the door. But they don't get very far.
The neighbors heard the shots, and at this point, the cops had already been called. So Annishia and David end up hearing the police, and they drop whatever they had, and they both run in different directions.
In his attempt to escape, he comes upon a fence, throws a gun, and tries to jump the fence and is caught by the police.
Police found Annishia hiding in David's car underneath the dashboard.
Caught, the toxic couple tries to talk their way out of trouble.
Somebody came and robbed me.
They both repeatedly lie to the police. She tries to pretend that she was just asleep in the car. She knows nothing about nothing. He initially said that they were walking down the street and somebody tried to rob them at gunpoint.
I didn't do nothing.
Police aren't buying his story because they realized at that point that there were 2 people shot inside that home.
Drew was able to survive, fortunately.
And pretty soon, officers have all the evidence they need.
The police ended up finding the gun that David used to shoot Charles and Drew, tossed in a neighbor's backyard.
It's a wrap for Annishia and David. They're arrested and hauled off to jail.
But the scheming continues even when the couple is behind bars.
Annishia and David communicate through dozens of letters, and it's clear who's still in control.
They're long letters, very cold and calculating. He's demanding loyalty from her. He's extremely nervous that she's going to flip on him.
David is telling Annishia what to say so that her story matches his story. The plan backfires. Annishia realizes that she doesn't want to spend a lot of time in jail. She wants to still be a part of her son's life. And she ends up cooperating with police and turns over those incriminating letters.
The letters help seal her man's fate, but nothing beats forensics.
The authorities were able to match the gun that was utilized to kill Charles Martin as the gun that was stolen from Corey.
Annishia not only turns in David's letters, she testifies at his trial a few years later.
David was found guilty of aggravated murder, aggravated robbery, aggravated burglary, and a host of weapons charges.
David is spared the death penalty and is sentenced to 45 years in prison without the possibility of parole.
Charles Martin's life was worth a lot more than a video game player. It's senseless and it's sad.
In exchange for her testimony, including admitting her part in the first robbery, she lands a much better deal.
Annishia pled guilty to aggravated robbery, aggravated burglary, manslaughter, attempted murder, and several weapons charges. With her plea, she was facing 48 years in prison, and she only received 10.
Ultimately, the man she loved proved to be her biggest downfall.
In the end, Annishia finally woke up, but it was too late.
Life was lost over greed, and life was taken because of loyalty and dedication to the wrong person.
Annishia Smith was addicted to the rush of using her sexuality to help her boyfriend rob her unsuspecting lovers. One state over, suburban mom Tina Young finds herself addicted to more than just love. In the rural town of Wyoming, Pennsylvania, Tina Young graduates from high school and is excited to start life. She has aspirations to work in the medical field, but those plans are put on hold when she meets the love of her life.
She met her husband, Todd. They were close to her age, around 18. They had their first child at 19 and quickly got married thereafter and began to build their family.
A few years later, the young couple moves 20 minutes away to nearby Dallas, Pennsylvania.
Tina was a young mom having children, and sometimes that can work because a young parent can grow with their children. It can be fun. But if that young parent doesn't take the time to nurture their own needs, then that could spell trouble.
Even before she can blink, another 10 years fly by. Now 32 years old, Tina has become the poster child for bored, tired suburban homemaker.
Tina Young was a mother of 3 And by all accounts, she was a typical mother. Stayed at home while her husband went to work and raised their children.
She is the epitome of the suburban soccer mom. She picks her boys up from school. She helps them with their homework. She's also the den mother to the scout troop. She has a routine that's getting quite monotonous and can be boring at times.
Oh my God, interception!
But it's during her son's busy schedules when they meet the Schechters. The two families both have 3 boys and instantly hit it off.
The ages are matching. The families are intertwined, doing a lot of activities together. It just seemed very second nature that these families would just connect the way they did.
And her friendship with Cynthia Schechter breathes new life to Tina's tedious days.
The two women become inseparable and become immediate best friends.
And Tina even helps her new friend out by watching her 3 boys on a regular basis.
She may have been babysitting the boys from time to time just for extra cash, but over the 7 years, she really began to think of them as her own.
The young mother appears to have it all: a handsome husband, 3 healthy children, and an extended family. But as the saying goes, things aren't always as they appear.
Tina is beginning to feel the challenges in her marriage. She and her husband barely have any time alone, and she begins to feel the distance that is causing.
It's a familiar story. Here she is, just barely out of her teens, having children, with a husband. The real issue becomes that if you don't have the time to spend with one another, and it's all about the children, then the relationship between husband and wife, it just does not grow.
And when this desperate mother meets a dangerous man, her humdrum home life gets all too exciting in the worst way imaginable.
Apparently, having it all just wasn't enough.
Tina's once happy home life turned into a horrific nightmare.
Dallas, Pennsylvania, 33-year-old Tina Young appears to be living the dream, a mother of 3 with a loving husband. But her love story is fizzling, and inside she's starting to come apart at the seams.
The everyday routine of being a housewife, of being a mother, the day-to-day just eventually just really started to wear on her, the reality of her suburban lifestyle.
And stressed out mom is also not happy with the way she looks.
After having the last baby, she had trouble losing the baby weight. She didn't think that her husband was paying as much attention to her as he once did.
Simply put, there is no excitement in her life anymore.
But that is all about to change when she turns to an old high school friend for advice.
This friend actually tells Tina she knows a surefire way for her to escape her mundane, boring life, and as an added bonus, she's actually going to lose some weight.
Tina is shocked by what her friend suggests is the solution to her problems: heroin.
Of all things, heroin. That is one of the most dangerous drugs known to man.
The responsible mother of 3 just says no, at first. But her friend insists that she at least take some of her stash and think about it. She even shows her how to shoot up. Tina reluctantly accepts the drugs. Doing her best to face another boring day, Tina can't stop thinking about her hidden supply. So the very next afternoon, Tina gives in.
Tina really wanted to lose the baby weight, and that was the hook. The possibility of saying, this is a magic pill. This will help you lose the weight. This will make you feel better. This will bring the excitement back into your relationship.
The desperate housewife shoots up, and the high is unlike anything she's ever felt.
Tina becomes enraptured with the drug. It's become her new high, and she definitely is not feeling those lows. She's never felt such a rush.
Within 1 week of her using the heroin, she was addicted.
Heroin addiction is one of the worst addictions there is. Heroin can be toxic, hazardous, and deadly.
Thanks to her distant marriage and her boy's busy schedule, Tina has no problem keeping her secret under wraps.
For her, for Todd, things continued to disintegrate. She thought, of course, in using, she was going to be able to regain that love. But it's not. It's just completely destroying what they once had.
A few months later, Tina's friend makes another introduction. And this one might prove to be even more destructive than heroin.
For the first several months of Tina's drug use, her friend is the one who purchases the drugs for her. But eventually, Tina's friend steps out and introduces her directly to her drug dealer. His name was Larry Tooley.
Larry's someone who's not a stranger to law enforcement. Low-level heroin dealer was someone who the police are aware of.
He had served time on assault and rape charges. He always carried a gun for protection.
And Larry even breaks the #1 rule of selling drugs.
Never get high on your own supply. And because he did so, he didn't make much money.
There's an instant spark between the suburban mom and the low-level drug dealer. Tina finally finds the excitement she's been craving.
For Tina, this is another world. This is a bad boy. This is something completely different from her suburban life. This is the edge.
Larry became Tina's supplier. He began a friendly relationship with her, and he trusted her. So he eventually gave Tina his phone number and allowed her to come and pick up drugs by herself without her friend.
The second-rate drug slinger looks at the bored housewife as an asset to his growing sales business.
Larry's seeing Tina as an opportunity to build a different sort of clientele. Keeping Tina in this cycle of addiction is profitable for him. He is able to develop a network to perhaps even draw in additional clients.
But that's not all he sees. He also feels a growing affection for his newest client, and a second flame is lit. Then about 3 months later, the illusion of Tina as a normal suburban housewife vanishes.
Todd's eyes were finally open one day when he's in their bathroom and he finds her drug paraphernalia hidden way in the back of the cabinet.
Tina!
After hiding this for a year, it just comes to a heated argument.
We have a family to be doing drugs.
And she finally admits to Todd she has an addiction. Her husband doesn't want this life, these drugs, and its impact around his children.
What do you want? This or me and the kids?
Tina's in a make-or-break situation now. The secret was out. She had a choice to make. Either she give up drugs and work on her marriage, or continue with this deadly life.
At some point, the addiction takes over your life. So people do strange things when they're addicted to this drug, and leaving their family is typical.
Leaving her children behind, the drug-addled mom goes to the only place she knows she won't be judged.
She headed over to Larry's apartment in Wilkes-Barre. It's located about 10 miles south of Dallas, Pennsylvania.
After Tina comes to Larry, tells him about the confrontation with her husband, Larry says that Tina can stay with him.
The unlikely pair have always had an undeniable connection. And with her husband out of the picture, they now have the freedom to explore their relationship even further.
Tina had her drug of choice, and her new man supplying her. It was a lethal combination.
She never thought her addiction would get someone killed.
In Dallas, Pennsylvania, suburban housewife Tina Young is addicted to heroin and has just left her husband of over 13 years and their 3 sons behind to move in with her drug dealer, Larry Tooley.
They became more than friends. Tina left her husband for Larry.
At the point that Tina moved in with Larry, she began to realize that she felt like she had more in common with him than she did her own husband.
And it's not long before they take things to the next level.
She feels confident and strong and beautiful and out of this depression that she found herself in.
But as the weeks go by, the lovebirds realize their life together isn't exactly a walk in the park.
The lifestyle of dependency is just starting to catch on with the couple. They are using much more than they're selling.
Larry and Tina were not able to support and sustain their habit.
I'm gonna need you to figure out a way to get some more.
They're borrowing money off the family members. Tina borrowed hundreds of dollars off her mother.
But that well runs dry quick. Tina looks to an old friend from her past life as a suburban mom, Cynthia Schechter.
Tina has always had a strong relationship with Cynthia, but since everything has fallen apart, the relationship is gone.
The women do their best to catch up.
In their conversation, Cynthia talks about her oldest son, Casey, with pride. He's 16. He's been able to save up almost $3,000 to buy a car.
Unfortunately, Tina's updates aren't as upbeat.
Tina tells her that she's just at a very low place and desperate. Cynthia feels for a friend and tries to help as best she can. She gives her $300 from Casey's car fund.
Cash in hand, the broke mom quickly says her goodbyes.
So what does she do? She goes right home to Larry so they can feed their habits.
A few days later, the burnt-out couple blow through their last few bags of heroin. And Larry comes down in a bad way.
You have any more?
Larry is going through really bad withdrawals.
We got to get...
He tells Tina at this point there's nothing he won't do, including harming someone.
I got something quick.
Frightened by her man's outburst, Tina must think fast.
Tina doesn't want Larry to go out and hurt anyone. She's afraid he's going to do something dangerous.
Cynthia.
Who was that?
She tells him about the conversation that she had with Cynthia and about the money that's there and that it's a quick, easy score.
She's never...
She explains that the parents are at work and the kids are at school during the day. And that's not all.
Tina knew that the Schechters did not lock their doors.
It seems like a foolproof plan, and the strung-out dealer is all in.
He needs work.
Tina wants nothing more than to make Larry happy, even if it means going against a friend who's willing to lend her money. There's nothing more important to her than this relationship with Larry.
The desperate duo wastes no time. The next morning, they make their move.
Tina makes the call to the home, making sure that no one's there. No one picks up. She knows at that point that they can get away with the burglary.
They make the 15-minute drive over to the Schechters and arrive around 10 a.m.
Tina pulls up into the driveway and pulls up next to the screen door that she knows is always unlocked.
She even takes one final precaution.
Tina exits her vehicle and goes inside the Schechter residence. She yells, "Hello, is anyone home?" And no one answered.
She is sure that no one is there and tells Larry the coast is clear. She then heads to the car to act as lookout. Larry grabs his gun, just in case, and then he heads into the house.
Larry starts tearing the house apart, looking for the money.
Come, money out.
Larry doesn't bother to be quiet. He thinks he's alone.
But the Schechter home wasn't empty.
The two eldest Schechter boys are hiding upstairs.
Riley wasn't feeling well, so Casey decided to stay home to watch him and to skip school for the day.
While the drug dealer continues his hunt for cash, 16-year-old Casey bravely goes downstairs to confront the intruder.
Casey says to Larry, "What are you doing? What are you doing in our home?"
Where's the money? You're lying to me. Where is the money?
Outside, Tina is oblivious to the escalating situation when suddenly
Tina hears the unmistakable sound of a gunshot.
Before Tina's life fell into turmoil, her whole life was her kids.
Tina and Todd not only were raising their 3 boys, but they decided to also foster children in the local community. They did so for over a period of 10 years.
In her throes of addiction, Tina has not only given up her biological children, but also her foster children.
In Dallas, Pennsylvania, while she waits in the car, Tina Young's boyfriend Larry Tooley is tossing what he thinks is an empty house, looking for a stash of cash. When 16-year-old Casey Schechter confronts him.
Casey heard all the ruckus and he went down and he said to Larry, what's going on? What are you doing?
The irritable dealer demands the teenager tell him where he can find the stash of cash.
He told him no. He didn't know what he was talking about, that the money that he had saved for his car was in the bank.
Where is the money?
Larry's enraged. Casey sees that. Larry has the gun.
But the strung-out addict doesn't believe him.
He shot Casey once in the chest. Casey pleads with him as he's bleeding out on the floor and tells him he doesn't have any money.
Larry takes the gun, tells him one more time.
Where is the money?
Casey is helpless.
Upstairs, Casey's younger brother, 14-year-old Riley, is hiding and terrified.
After the second shot, Riley was very afraid of what was happening. He broke through a screen window and then jumped down onto the ground.
Out in the car, Tina hears the second shot and is stunned by what and who she sees next.
She sees Riley take off frantic. No one was supposed to be in the house, so Tina's panicked. The plan's gone horribly wrong.
Horrified at what she might find, Tina rushes into the home, and her worst nightmare has come true.
She sees Casey, a boy she's known since he was about 8 years old, lying there bleeding, all because of her.
She yells to Larry and turns to Casey, puts one final bullet in his head, and then says,
Knowing police could show up at any second, the couple flee. Tina begs her boyfriend to explain why he just killed an unarmed 16-year-old kid. He tells her that although he only managed to get $57 off of Casey, he shot him because he could ID him.
Tina then tells Larry that she saw Riley jump out of the window.
Stop the car!
Now that Larry knows they have a witness, he tells Tina they gotta get out of town quick.
The couple pack up a few items and hit the road. They hightail it 100 miles away to the dealer's hometown of Paterson, New Jersey.
Larry hits up a few family members, but no one really wants to help out.
That night, they crash at a cheap motel and use what little money they have left to shoot up.
After Casey was dead, it's no surprise that Tina went back to what helped her cope with life. She went back to that drug. That is the power of addiction.
Back in Dallas, Pennsylvania, neighbors contact the authorities after Riley shows up on their doorstep, and police arrive at the grisly crime scene.
This horrible tragedy taking away a young life. A 16-year-old dreams, 16-year-old hopes, all taken away because of someone's addiction.
The crime was one of the worst acts of violence I've seen in my 15 years of investigative services.
Detectives start with their only witness.
Riley was interviewed and told what he had heard, what he had seen, and that was the turning point where we were able to identify a suspect, which was Tina. And that led us to Larry.
Investigators launch a manhunt for the murderous couple.
Police question Larry's family, and they tell him yes, he'd been over looking for money, but was headed out of town for a while.
The very next day, detectives catch a break. The couple is spotted on the streets of Paterson outside a liquor store.
Larry and Tina were taken into custody for the murder of Casey.
Under the hot lights of the interrogation room, the couple tell very different tales.
Larry outright lied about all of his involvement, but during the interview with Tina, she admitted her involvement in the murder, and she was remorseful about what had transpired.
Tina must have felt a tremendous amount of guilt, knowing that she was responsible for her friend Cynthia's son's death. And now Cynthia would have to go through life without her beloved son.
About a year later, the former couple faced the music.
Larry was found guilty of murder in the first degree, burglary, criminal conspiracy to commit burglary.
He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Tina pled guilty to murder in the second degree and burglary.
Tina was sentenced to 19 to 40 years in prison.
In the end, Tina traded one set of problems for another. Those choices changed her life forever.
The neon glow of the Phoenix strip malls always looked like bleeding ink under the heavy, dust-choked desert air of November 2010, a sweltering winter night when the silence of the valley was shattered by a disappearance that would freeze the blood of Maricopa County for over a decade. 22-year-old single mother Maya Lynn left her shift at a diner on the edge of the grid, stepping into a darkness that felt almost solid, her car keys found glinting beneath a flickering street lamp hours later with the engine still warm and her purse left untouched on the passenger seat. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, No shattered glass, just an abrupt, terrifying vacuum where a human life had been just moments before, sending panic surging through a community that prided itself on master-plan security, but now looked out at the jagged desert horizons with a creeping, visceral dread. The initial police response was a frantic race against the drifting sands, search parties tearing through the sun-baked arroyos with flashlights cutting erratic, desperate lines into the brush, yet every ravine remained stubbornly empty, and every tip dissolved into the dry desert wind. Witnesses spoke of a dark, nondescript SUV idling near the alleyway with its headlights extinguished, its exhaust coughing softly into the cooling air before slipping away into the midnight traffic without a trace, leaving investigators with nothing but a lingering shadow and a stack of missing person flyers that would turn yellow under the Arizona sun. The case file grew thick with dead ends. The names of local transients and estranged acquaintances systematically crossed off the list until the ink ran dry, leaving the Lynn family trapped in an agonizing, eternal loop of unanswered questions while the city expanded around the void she left behind. Year after year, the file sat in the deep metal cabinets of the Phoenix Homicide Division, calcifying into a legendary cold case, a phantom that haunted the precinct corridors, a name spoken only in hushed tones by veteran detectives who knew that beneath the pristine suburbs lay a darkness that refused to yield its secrets. The silence grew heavy enough to suffocate the neighborhood, transforming the quiet cul-de-sacs into zones of unspoken suspicion where neighbors watched neighbors through slatted blinds, the collective consciousness of Phoenix permanently scarred by the knowledge that a monster had walked their streets and vanished without a whisper. The family's house became a monument to that frozen night, Maya's room untouched, the air holding the faint scent of her perfume like a trap, her child growing up looking at a photograph of a mother who had become nothing more than a ghost, a warning told to young women across the state. Detectives retired, their notebooks handed down to fresh recruits who stared at the grainy security footage from the diner with exhausted, burning eyes, trying to find a detail they had missed, a reflection in the glass, a license plate hidden in the digital noise, but the desert kept its pact with the killer. The investigation ground to a total, catastrophic halt, the physical evidence yielding no usable DNA, the tire tracks washed away by a decade of flash floods, the public interest fading into the background noise of new tragedies until the name Maya Lynn became an asterisk in the municipal record of violence. But the past is a volatile thing, waiting for the right spark to ignite the hidden fuel of buried guilt, a reckoning that would not come from the badge or the courtroom, but from the digital ether, a localized true crime podcast that decided to drag the city's deepest shame back into the blinding light of modern scrutiny. In the spring of 2026, a raw, uncompromising investigative podcast titled Valley of Silence launched a multi-part deep dive into the Lynn case, its host microanalyzing the original timelines, broadcasting forgotten witness statements, and throwing a massive, high-wattage spotlight on the geographic anomalies that the 2010 task force had dismissed as mere coincidence. The audio waves rippled through the Phoenix suburbs like a low-frequency tremor, shaking loose memories that had settled deep into the marrow of the community, forcing people to confront the details of a sweltering night they had spent 16 years trying to forget. By the 5th episode, the podcast's secure tip line began to hum with erratic, frightened messages, but it was one specific, anonymous voiceover, a trembling, breathless 5-minute audio file that changed the trajectory of the investigation forever, detailing a confession overheard in the back room of a prominent local ministry just days after Maya vanished. The informant laid out a terrifyingly precise map of the killer's psychological state, describing a man who had utilized his immense social capital, his image of absolute piety, and the sanctuary of the altar to mask a violent, predatory obsession that had culminated in the dark alley behind the diner. The tip didn't point to a known criminal or a transient on the margins of society. It pointed straight to the heart of the community's spiritual life, naming Reverend Thomas Miller, the beloved, charismatic pastor of Christ Covenant Church, a man who had comforted the Lynn family at Maya's candlelight vigil. The revelation hit the homicide division like a physical blow, a sudden, violent alignment of puzzle pieces that had remained scattered for nearly 2 decades, forcing a new generation of detectives to covertly reopen the vaults and look at the pastor not as a pillar of the community, but as a calculated, hyper-efficient sociopath. They began a silent, high-level surveillance operation, tracking Miller's movements from his manicured suburban estate to the glass and steel megachurch where he delivered weekly sermons on redemption and the sanctity of life, his voice booming through the speakers while undercover agents sat in the back pews, recording his cadences, analyzing his micro-expressions, and mapping his historical cell tower data against the 2010 logbooks. The digital reconstruction was devastating. The pastor's private mobile device, long since discarded but preserved in carrier archives, had pinged off the tower directly overlooking the diner at the exact timestamp Maya's keys hit the asphalt, a detail that had been completely overlooked in 2010 because the church's alibi had been accepted without a single follow-up question. The detectives worked in absolute, suffocating secrecy, knowing that a single leak would allow the deeply connected pastor to destroy evidence, manipulate his flock, or vanish into the vast expanses of the Mexican border just hours away, their movements executed with surgical, terrifying precision. The psychological profile compiled by the task force painted a picture of a predator who derived a sickening, godlike thrill from his dual existence, a man who could lead a congregation in prayer for the missing girl on Sunday morning while knowing exactly which patch of scorched desert earth held her remains, using the very grief of the community as a shield against suspicion. As the net tightened, investigators uncovered financial anomalies from the church's discretionary funds in late 2010, sudden, unexplained cash withdrawals that aligned perfectly with the days immediately following the abduction, suggesting a frantic, covert cleanup operation, the purchasing of silence, or the disposal of the dark SUV that had vanished from the pastor's driveway under the guise of a charitable donation. The pressure within the precinct was explosive, the team working through the blistering Arizona nights, cross-referencing old tire iron logs with the specific structural repairs made to the pastor's property, until they had built an airtight, undeniable fortress of circumstantial and digital evidence that was ready to be unleashed. The flashpoint arrived on a Tuesday morning, the tactical units moving into position around the church offices with silent, lethal efficiency, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the stained glass windows as the detectives stepped through the heavy oak doors to dismantle a 16-year lie. The arrest sent an immediate, seismic shockwave through the entire state of Arizona. The images of the beloved pastor let out in handcuffs and his clerical collar plastered across every news screen, breaking the hearts of thousands of parishioners who gathered outside the police barriers in a state of weaponized denial, screaming for his release, while the Lynn family watched from the shadows of their living room, their tears a mixture of ancient grief and sudden, terrifying vindication. Inside the interrogation room, the pastor's serene, holy facade began to crack under the relentless, clinical pressure of the detectives, his smooth, practiced explanations dissolving when confronted with the immutable data of the 2010 cell towers and the sudden, devastating testimony of the podcast informant who had finally agreed to step forward under federal protection. The legal battle that followed was a media circus of monumental proportions, a high-stakes, direct confrontation between the institutional power of a massive religious organization and the cold, unyielding mechanics of modern cold case forensics, the prosecution systematically stripping away the defendant's armor until nothing was left but the raw, terrifying reality of the crime. As the trial commenced in downtown Phoenix, the gallery was packed with a fractured community, half of them still weeping for their fallen spiritual leader, the other half staring at the defense table with a burning, righteous fury as the state laid out the definitive timeline of the night Maya Lynn was hunted down, her life extinguished by the very man who would later offer to pray for her soul. The prosecution used the podcast audio as the narrative spine of their case, playing the trembling voice of the tipster through the courtroom speakers, a sound that filled the room with the undeniable presence of the truth, making the jurors lean forward as the clinical details of the pastor's obsession were laid bare. The defense attempted to paint the entire investigation as a modern witch hunt driven by digital hysteria and media overreach, but the digital footprints left behind in the 2010 cellular grids were too precise, too damning, and too absolute to be rationalized away by theological rhetoric or character references from local politicians. The jury watched the defendant's face, noting the cold, detached arrogance that replaced his holy demeanor when the evidence reached its peak, the mask slipping completely to reveal the face of the monster who had kept the valley in terror for 16 years. The deliberation was short, tense, and absolute, the verdict of guilty ringing through the packed courtroom like a thunderclap, a sound that brought the long, agonizing journey of the Lynn family to its definitive, legal conclusion while cementing the Valley of Silence podcast as a historic landmark in the evolution of civilian-led justice. The pastor was sentenced to consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, his destination the maximum security unit in Florence, Arizona, where the concrete walls would permanently absorb the voice that had misled thousands, leaving his megachurch to slowly collapse under the weight of its own toxic hypocrisy. But the resolution of the case did not instantly heal the wounds of the city. It left behind a profound, ambient trauma, a realization that the ultimate danger is never the stranger in the dark, but the man who stands in the light, the one who wins your trust, the one who holds your hand during your darkest hours while holding the key to your destruction. The desert outside Phoenix remains vast, hot, and indifferent, but the air in the valley feels lighter now. The ghost of Maya Lynn finally allowed to slip away from the diner alleyway and the yellowed cold case files, her memory rescued from the stasis of 2010 and placed into the permanent, protected record of those who were fought for, those who were found, and those whose justice was demanded. The detectives who closed the file walked out into the desert night, their flashlights turned off, their notebooks closed, the heavy metal drawers of the precinct shut with a sound of finality that echoed across the sleeping city, a reminder that no matter how deep the burial, no matter how long the silence, and no matter how holy the cover, the truth will always find a way to break the earth and demand its day in the light. The immediate wake of Reverend Thomas Miller's arrest did not bring the comforting embrace of closure to Maricopa County. Instead, it ushered in a period of intense, claustrophobic scrutiny that felt as suffocating as a midsummer dust storm. The initial shockwave that rippled out from the glass-clad complex of Christ Covenant Church left a community teetering on the edge of collective psychological collapse, as thousands of citizens who had spent 16 years looking outward at the desert for a nameless boogeyman were forced to turn their gaze inward, toward the very altar where they had sought salvation. The precinct's cold case division, suddenly transformed into a high-security war room, became a hive of frantic, clinical activity as detectives realized that arresting the pastor was only the first step in dismantling a massive, multi-layered fortress of deception that had survived intact since 2010. Investigative teams were split into specialized units, some tasked with the grueling, meticulous process of auditing 16 years of church financial records, while others re-examined every single piece of physical evidence from the night Maya Lynn vanished, looking for the subtle, microscopic traces of a predator who had hidden in plain sight beneath a cloak of absolute piety. The air inside the Phoenix Police Headquarters was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the heavy, electric tension of an investigation that could not afford a single misstep, knowing that the defense would weaponize every procedural anomaly to protect a man with deep, systemic roots in the city's political and social hierarchy. As the digital forensics team dove deeper into the cellular data archives resurrected by the Valley of Silence podcast tip-off, they began to uncover the precise, chilling mechanics of the pastor's movements on that fateful November night in 2010. The cell tower pings, which had been dismissed during the initial, surface-level inquiry because of Miller's airtight, institutional alibi, were now subjected to advanced mapping software that tracked the specific sector handoffs of his mobile device with terrifying accuracy. The data revealed that while the church administration was telling investigators that the Reverend was in his private study preparing a Thanksgiving sermon, his phone was actively communicating with towers along the exact, dark corridor leading to the diner where Maya worked her final shift. The timeline became a claustrophobic, minute-by-minute countdown. The phone pings moving closer to the diner alleyway at 10:45 p.m., dropping into total radio silence for a critical 45-minute window that perfectly aligned with the estimated time of the abduction, and then re-emerging on a tower 6 miles north, deep within an undeveloped, jagged section of the desert landscape. This digital footprint was not just a piece of circumstantial evidence. It was a map of a deliberate hunt, a clinical tracking of an unsuspecting target by a man who understood that his public image afforded him an almost invisible status in the eyes of the law. Simultaneously, the physical search for Maya Lin's vehicle logs and the dark SUV witnessed in 2010 led detectives to a high-end automotive restoration shop on the outskirts of Scottsdale, where a retired mechanic provided a crucial, trembling testimony that broke through a decade of enforced silence. The witness recalled that in late November 2010, just 48 hours after the disappearance became front-page news, Reverend Miller had brought in a black, late-model luxury SUV for an immediate, total interior deep clean and panel replacement, paying in cash and invoking pastoral privilege to avoid the standard paperwork. The mechanic remembered the pastor's demeanor as unnaturally calm, a contrast to the frantic urgency with which he demanded the removal of the rear floor mats and the complete detailing of the cargo area, claiming that the vehicle had been used to transport damp charitable goods that had mildewed in the desert heat. The realization that they had unwittingly helped erase the physical evidence of a homicide had haunted the shop owner for 16 years, a lingering guilt that finally dissolved into cooperation as he handed over a dust-covered, handwritten ledger containing the exact vehicle identification number linked directly to the church's corporate fleet. This breakthrough allowed the forensic team to track the vehicle through 3 subsequent sales, eventually locating the chassis in a salvage yard near the Mexican border, where specialized technicians began the painstaking process of scanning the stripped metal for chemical signatures or microscopic blood splatters that had survived the passage of time. Back at the precinct, the interrogation rooms became the arena for an intense, high-stakes game of psychological chess between seasoned cold case detectives and a suspect who had spent his entire adult life mastering the art of narrative control and emotional manipulation. Thomas Miller sat across the steel table clad in an orange jumpsuit that contrasted sharply with his manicured hands and composed, authoritative posture, his voice maintaining the same rich, comforting baritone that had drawn thousands to his weekly sermons. He did not yell, he did not panic. Instead, he responded to every piece of mounting evidence with a chilling, detached serenity, weaving complex theological explanations for his presence near the crime scene and painting himself as a martyr who was being sacrificed to satisfy the modern media's thirst for sensationalism. He claimed that his late-night desert excursions were part of an unrecorded, confidential street ministry aimed at rescuing troubled youth, arguing that his interaction with Maya Lin was strictly pastoral, a counseling session that had taken place days before her disappearance to help her navigate the struggles of single motherhood. But the detectives were no longer listening to the sermon. They were watching the subtle, telltale physical tics, the tightening of the jaw when the Scottsdale garage ledger was produced, the sudden, shallow breathing when the digital cell maps were laid across the table, signs that the holy mask was beginning to choke the monster underneath. Outside the interrogation rooms, the city itself was becoming a battleground of conflicting narratives as the massive congregation of Christ Covenant Church mobilized a high-powered, multi-million-dollar defense fund, hiring top-tier trial attorneys who immediately launched an aggressive public relations campaign designed to discredit the police department and the Valley of Silence podcast. The church elders issued fiery statements from the pulpit, calling the arrest a direct assault on the faith community and demanding the immediate release of their spiritual leader, while outside the precinct doors, crowds of faithful supporters held nightly candlelit vigils, their prayers mingling with the aggressive chants of local activists demanding justice for Maya Lin. The Lin family, trapped in the eye of this media hurricane, remained secluded in their modest home, their front lawn swarmed by news trucks with satellite dishes pointed at the sky, their privacy shattered by the very resolution they had spent 16 years praying for. Maya's mother, her face etched with the deep, permanent lines of systemic grief, looked out through the blinds at the chaos, realizing that the fight for her daughter's memory was no longer a lonely search in the desert sands, but a loud, public war for the truth against an institution that would stop at nothing to protect its own survival. The tension reached a boiling point when the Digital Forensics Unit successfully cracked the encrypted archives of the church's private internal server, uncovering a hidden cache of emails and internal memos from late 2010 that proved the church leadership had been aware of Miller's erratic, obsessive behavior long before the arrest. The documents revealed a series of desperate, closed-door meetings where elders discussed the pastor's inappropriate, late-night text messages to young female parishioners, his unverified expenses, and complaints from salon employees regarding his predatory, lingering presence. Rather than reporting these red flags to the authorities, the institution had chosen to protect the brand, implementing a quiet, internal counseling program and shifting church funds to cover up the growing cracks in the pastor's personal life. This discovery transformed the case from a singular homicide investigation into a far-reaching, systemic conspiracy inquiry, as prosecutors realized they weren't just dealing with an isolated killer, but with an entire corporate structure that had effectively subsidized the concealment of a monster to maintain its financial and social dominance over the valley. As the late November heat began to give way to the cool desert nights of December 2026, the task force finalized the comprehensive arrest warrant and indictment files, a mountain of data that represented 16 years of failure finally corrected by 6 months of relentless, technologically driven persistence. The case was formally handed over to the Maricopa County Superior Court, setting the stage for a judicial confrontation that would stand as the most significant, highly anticipated trial in the history of the Southwest. The detectives, exhausted but resolute, stood in the dark parking lot of the precinct, watching the neon lights of the city flicker against the black mountain silhouettes, knowing that the easy part of their work was over and that the real battle for Maya Lin's memory would unfold under the blinding, unforgiving lights of the courtroom, where no amount of holy water could wash away the stains of the desert dirt. The transition from the cold interrogation cells of the Maricopa County Jail to the high-stakes theater of the Maricopa County Superior Court marked the beginning of a public reckoning that Phoenix had evaded for 16 years. As January 2027 arrived, bringing with it a crisp, biting desert air that did nothing to cool the explosive social tension gripping the valley, the trial of State versus Thomas Miller officially commenced. The courthouse plaza was instantly converted into a sprawling media village, wired with thick television cables, satellite dishes pointed at the sky, and hundreds of protesters whose dueling chants clashed under the blinding Arizona sun. Inside room 402, the atmosphere was suffocating, thick with the scent of old wood, floor polish, and the collective anxiety of an audience waiting for a holy empire to fracture. The prosecution, led by a clinical, unyielding assistant district attorney who had spent her entire youth watching her father work the unresolved homicide lines, stood before the selected jury panel, recognizing that their opening statement could not be an academic lecture on genetics or cellular physics. It had to be a visceral, real-time reconstruction of a night where a young woman's life was systematically hunted down by a man who used the ultimate cover of divine authority to mask a deep, predatory malice. The state's opening narrative moved with the relentless, dawn-dap rhythm of a crime thriller, stripping away the polished, comforting persona of the beloved local pastor within the first 10 minutes of the address. The prosecutor painted a picture of Phoenix in late 2010, a city expanding rapidly into the desert sands, an environment where master-planned security gates offered an illusion of safety while the reality of human vulnerability remained exposed in the dark alleyways behind suburban strips. She detailed the exact movements of Maya Lin on that final, sweltering evening, tracking her from the bright, noisy comfort of the diner kitchen to the precise moment her fingers slipped off her car keys beneath the flickering parking lot lamp. The jury watched as large, high-definition digital monitors flickered to life, showing the original 2010 police diagrams side by side with the modern, three-dimensional cellular mapping data generated by the Valley of Silence Task Force. The contrast was devastating. The old files represented a fragmented, blind investigation that had been successfully managed and misdirected by a suspect who knew exactly which buttons of institutional respectability to push, while the new data formed an unbreakable, multi-layered net that pulled the defendant directly out of his church sanctuary and placed him at the mouth of that dark alleyway at 10:45 p.m. The defense hit back with aggressive, high-decibel opening strategy that sought to exploit the deep, cultural fractures within the community, painting the entire state case as an unholy alliance between a sensationalist, profit-driven digital medium and a police department desperate to salvage its own reputation after 16 years of systemic failure. Miller's lead counsel, a legendary Southwestern trial attorney known for his ability to charm juries with a mixture of folksy rhetoric and brutal, technical cross-examinations, argued that the Valley of Silence podcast had poisoned the investigative pool, using unverified, anonymous rumors to destroy the character of a man who had dedicated his entire adult existence to the moral elevation of Phoenix. He argued that the cell tower pings were an inexact science, a digital approximation that could easily mistake a pastor driving past a highway corridor during a late-night crisis counseling mission for a predator stalking a victim. The defendant sat motionless during this legal warfare, clad in impeccably tailored dark suit that his defense fund had secured through special court dispensation, his head held at an angle of dignified endurance, his eyes fixed on the jury box with the same calm, authoritative focus he had used to command thousands of souls from his glass pulpit. The first week of the trial was a grueling, technical march through the digital debris of 2010, as the state called its foundational forensic analysts to the stand to validate the data that had broken the 16-year silence. The digital forensics unit chief spent 2 full days explaining the mechanics of historical cell tower sector handoffs, guiding the jury through the dense terrain of network logs that proved Thomas Miller's private mobile device had not been stationary in his residential study, as his initial alibi claimed. The prosecution introduced a sequence of high-resolution graphic overlays that showed the pastor's phone moving across the valley like a beacon, stepping from tower to tower with a calculated, steady progression that tracked Maya Lynn's departure from her home, her route to work, and the final, fatal intersection behind the diner. When the analyst reached the 45-minute window of total radio silence, the exact period where the device was completely turned off or plunged into an unnetworked state, the silence in the courtroom became heavy, an ambient chill that seemed to settle into the bones of the jurors as they realized that the holy man's phone had gone dark at the precise moment a young mother's life had been plunged into eternal shadow. The emotional peak of the prosecution's case arrived midweek with the introduction of the physical evidence recovered from the Scottsdale Automotive Restoration Yard, the dust-covered, handwritten ledger that contained the corporate vehicle identification number of the church's 2010 luxury SUV. The prosecution called the retired mechanic whose memory had been unlocked by the podcast broadcast, his voice trembling under the microphone as he recounted the unnatural, chilling composure of the pastor during that early morning drop-off just 48 hours after Maya vanished. The witness identified Thomas Miller in open court, his fingers shaking as he pointed across the room at the defense table, recalling how the Reverend had insisted on paying double in cash to ensure the vehicle's rear cargo area was completely stripped, detailed, and sanitized without a digital invoice being logged into the shop's main computer system. The defense launched a vicious, targeted cross-examination, attempting to paint the aging mechanic as an unreliable witness whose memory had been manipulated by the leading questions of the podcast host and the promise of modern media notoriety, but the old man held his ground, his raw, unvarnished honesty forming a powerful contrast against the slick, polished legal maneuvers of the defense team. The state then pivoted from the physical mechanics of the cover-up to the dark, psychological undercurrents of the crime, introducing the heavily contested internal emails and server memos seized from Christ Covenant Church's digital infrastructure. Over the strenuous, explosive objections of the defense, the prosecution read a series of messages from late 2010 that revealed a hidden world of institutional panic within the church leadership regarding Miller's erratic, obsessive patterns. The documents proved that the church elders had been tracking the pastor's predatory text messages to vulnerable female parishioners long before Maya Lynn stepped out of that diner, demonstrating that the institution had actively chosen to bury the warning signs to protect its financial brand and its social standing within Maricopa County. This evidence transformed the trial from a simple investigation into an individual act of violence into a broader, more terrifying exposure of institutional complicity, forcing the jury to confront the reality that a monster had been systematically subsidized, protected, and insulated from the law by the very people who claimed to be the community's moral guardians. As the second week of testimony drew to a close, the courtroom braced for the most anticipated, dangerous witness in the entire proceeding, the anonymous tipster whose 5-minute audio file on the Valley of Silence podcast had shattered the case open. When the individual was escorted into the room under heavy, visible federal protection, the collective intake of breath from the gallery was audible, the silence returning instantly as she took the oath. She was a former high-ranking administrative assistant within the church ministry, a woman who had lived for 16 years with the crushing, nightmarish weight of a secret she had been ordered to keep by the church elders under the threat of absolute spiritual and financial ruin. Her voice, though steady at first, cracked as she described sitting in the adjacent office on the morning of November 24, 2010, overhearing a muffled, weeping confession through the heavy oak doors, Thomas Miller admitting to a senior elder that his obsession had turned to dust in the desert, his voice stripped of its holy baritone, replaced by the raw, panicked rattle of a man who had just left a body beneath the sand. The cross-examination of the informant was a display of legal brutality, as the defense spent hours attempting to dismantle her credibility, mining her personal history for vulnerabilities, financial struggles, and past disputes with the church administration to frame her testimony as an act of calculated, bitter revenge. They hammered at her 16-year delay, demanding to know why a woman of conscience would allow a young mother's family to suffer in absolute agony for over a decade if she truly possessed the knowledge of a murder. The witness looked directly at the jury, tears spilling over her eyelids, and stated with an unvarnished, terrifying simplicity that she had been terrified of the pastor's absolute power over her life, her family, and her safety, recognizing that in 2010, the word of a single mother's friend would have been instantly crushed by the massive, multi-million-dollar shield of the ministry. This raw, emotional honesty neutralized the defense's technical traps, leaving the jury with a vivid, unforgettable picture of a community held hostage by the very authority it trusted to save them. The prosecution closed its presentation of evidence by calling Maya Lin's mother to the stand, a moment that shifted the focus of the trial away from the cold mechanics of digital mapping and institutional conspiracy back to the devastating, permanent human cost of the crime. The elderly woman carried a small, framed photograph of Maya from the summer of 2010, young, smiling, and holding her infant child, placing it on the witness stand before she spoke a single word. Her testimony was short, stripped of any anger or desire for vengeance, consisting entirely of a quiet, crushing description of the 16-year void that had replaced her daughter's presence in their home. She described the agony of watching Maya's child grow up asking questions that the valley could not answer, of driving past the desert every day wondering which patch of scorched earth held the remains of her baby, her words dropping into the silent courtroom like heavy, rhythmic stones, creating a moral weight that no amount of legal rhetoric or theological posturing could dismantle. When the defense finally began its presentation, the strategy shifted toward a desperate effort to create a baseline of reasonable doubt by introducing character witnesses from the highest echelons of Arizona's political and business circles. A succession of local developers, philanthropic directors, and political strategists took the stand to testify to Thomas Miller's immense contributions to the civic development of Phoenix, attempting to paint him as a visionary leader whose life of public service rendered the allegations fundamentally impossible. But these testimonies felt hollow, increasingly detached from the cold, clinical reality of the cell tower maps and the Scottsdale garage ledgers that remained displayed on the prosecution's monitors. The jury's expression grew increasingly remote as the defense references mounted, their focus remaining fixed on the empty space behind the diner alleyway that the state had spent 2 weeks meticulously reconstructing with the surgical tools of modern science. The final, explosive moment of the trial arrived when the prosecution, during its closing rebuttal argument, played a synchronized media file that layered the pastor's 2010 sermon from Maya Lin's public candlelight vigil directly over the digital cell tower map of his movements from the night of her disappearance. The courtroom speakers boomed with Miller's rich, comforting voice praying for the lost lamb of the valley and calling on the community to look into the light, while on the screen, the glowing digital cursor tracked his luxury SUV slipping through the midnight shadows toward the desert sector handoff, where the phone went silent. This terrifying juxtaposition of holy performance and predatory reality was the final, definitive blow to the defense, leaving the jury with an inescapable, haunting image of a monster who used the language of God to cover the footprints of a demon. As the judge handed the case over to the panel for deliberation, the air in room 402 remained electric, the city of Phoenix holding its breath as the sun began to set behind the jagged mountains, casting long, dark shadows across a valley that was finally about to learn the price of its own silence. The transition from the high-stakes theater of room 402 to the absolute silence of the jury deliberation room marked the beginning of a torturous, pressure cooker vacuum that held the entire city of Phoenix hostage. For 24 hours, the downtown courthouse plaza remained a modern-day coliseum of conflicting energies, the blistering desert air thick with the exhaust of news vans and the low, constant murmur of hundreds of people who refused to leave the concrete steps. Inside the jury room, 12 ordinary citizens of Maricopa County were tasked with dismantling a 16-year-old empire of deceit, their table piled high with the digital cell tower overlays, the Scottsdale garage ledgers, and the transcripts of a voice that had once commanded their ultimate respect. The deliberation was not a debate over the science. The forensic data was too precise, too clinical, and too devastating to be rationalized away by theological rhetoric. Instead, it was an emotional reckoning with the sheer enormity of the betrayal, a slow, painful acceptance that the man who had stood at the center of their community's moral framework was the very predator who had left a single mother to be swallowed by the desert sands. When the buzzer finally rang, signaling that a verdict had been reached, the collective intake of breath across the courthouse plaza was almost audible, a wave of absolute, terrifying stillness washing over the media village as reporters scrambled for their live microphones. Inside the courtroom, the silence was total, a suffocating weight that seemed to press down on the oak benches as the jury filed back into the box, their faces unreadable, stone masks of civic duty. Reverend Thomas Miller stood at the defense table, his posture still maintaining a rigid, defiant illusion of pastoral dignity, his eyes fixed on the judge as the clerk unfolded the paper that would permanently rewrite the history of the valley. The word guilty did not explode into the room. It landed with the heavy, metallic thud of a cell door slamming shut, repeated count after count, first-degree murder, kidnapping, and fraudulent schemes, each syllable stripping away a layer of the holy armor that had protected a monster for nearly 2 decades. In the gallery, Maya Lynn's mother collapsed into the arms of her remaining family, her tears silent, deep, and unbreaking, while across the room, the remaining elders of Christ Covenant Church sat in a state of absolute, hollowed-out shock, their corporate shield shattered into 1,000 pieces by the cold, immutable reality of the law. The sentencing phase, which followed 48 hours later, was a clinical, uncompromising display of judicial anger that offered no path to redemption and no room for pastoral privilege. The judge addressed the defendant not as a religious leader or a community pillar, but as a calculated, predatory sociopath who had used the most sacred instincts of human trust to facilitate and cover up a brutal act of violence. The sentence was maxed out to the absolute limit of Arizona law, consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, ensuring that Thomas Miller's voice would never again echo through a megachurch speaker or comfort a grieving family, his destination the maximum security concrete complex in Florence, Arizona, where the harsh desert sun would look down on his absolute, enforced obscurity. As the deputies moved in to chain his ankles and wrists, the sound of the metal clinking against the courtroom floor was the final, definitive punctuation mark on a career built on the blood of the missing, a sound that signaled the total collapse of a holy illusion that had held Phoenix blind for 16 long years. The immediate aftermath of the verdict was a period of rapid, chaotic liquidation for the empire that Miller had constructed, as Christ Covenant Church became a toxic zone of financial and moral bankruptcy. Within weeks, The glass and steel megacomplex that had once drawn thousands of worshippers every Sunday stood completely empty, its doors chained, its manicured grounds overtaken by the drifting desert dust, and its multi-million-dollar assets seized by the state to pay for the massive civil judgments brought by the Lin family. The institutional cover-up that had been exposed during the trial triggered a secondary wave of criminal investigations into the church elders who had buried the internal warning signs, proving to the valley that the rot was not isolated to a single man, but had permeated the entire corporate structure of the ministry. This systemic dismantling was a stark, visceral reminder to every institution in Arizona that no amount of social capital or religious authority could act as a permanent shield against the long-range, technologically driven persistence of modern cold case forensics. For the Valley of Silence podcast team, the verdict was a historic, unprecedented vindication that permanently altered the landscape of civilian-led investigative journalism, demonstrating that a digital medium could succeed where traditional systems had stagnated for a generation. The show's host, having faced months of intense legal threats, public harassment, and corporate intimidation from the church's high-priced legal defense, became the architect of a new standard of public interest broadcasting, proving that the weaponization of crowdsourced data and investigative rigor could force the state to reopen the most carefully guarded vaults of the past. The anonymous informant, whose 5-minute audio file had been the catalyst for the entire resolution, remained under deep federal protection, her identity permanently shielded from a community that was still processing the deep, structural betrayal she had courageously exposed. The physical neighborhood behind the strip malls where Maya Lin had stepped out of the diner kitchen began a slow, deliberate process of spatial healing. The alleyway that had once been defined by an open-car door and a terrifying vacuum finally brought into the light of modern civic redevelopment. The city council voted unanimously to demolish the old, abandoned structures surrounding the site, replacing the dark corridor with a bright, well-lit pedestrian transit zone designed to eliminate the shadows that had harbored a predator in 2010. The flickering street lamp beneath which her keys had been found was replaced by a permanent, modern lighting system that illuminated a small, granite memorial plaque, a marker that did not name the monster or detail the horror of his crime, but simply recorded Maya's name, her age, and her status as a mother whose memory would forever belong to the light of the valley. The impact on the Phoenix Police Department's homicide division was structural and permanent, with the Lin Protocol becoming the mandatory baseline for how all unresolved disappearances are tracked and maintained across Maricopa County. The case had exposed a massive, systemic flaw in the old methods of investigation, proving that an airtight social alibi or a high-ranking position within the community's elite should never again be accepted as a reason to bypass cellular tracking or financial audits. A new generation of detectives took over the cold case division, looking at the heavy metal filing cabinets not as tombs of dead ends, but as active databases of temporary secrets that were simply waiting for the continuous, relentless advancement of forensic science and digital reconstruction to reveal their answers. As the months turned into the summer of 2027, the long, slow return of Maya Lin's memory to a state of dignified peace became the true, quiet victory of the entire saga, a reality that belonged entirely to her family far from the cameras of the national media. The Lin home ceased to be a shuttered monument to a frozen November night. The missing person flyers were finally taken down from the kitchen cabinets. The room that had been preserved in the amber of 2010 was gently, lovingly reorganized, and her child, now entering late adolescence, was finally given an answer that was not a ghost story, but a record of absolute justice. The desert outside the valley remained vast, hot, and indifferent, its shifting sands continuing to swallow the footprints of the living, but the air within the city boundaries felt lighter, the heavy, suffocating silence of the last 16 years replaced by the clean, unburdened rhythm of a community that had finally looked into its own dark blind spot and refused to blink. The final, silent artifacts of the long struggle, the cell tower logs, the Scottsdale garage ledgers, the internal church memos, and the digital files of the Valley of Silence, were permanently cataloged and sealed within the state's forensic archives, a massive repository of historical truth that stood as a permanent, immovable barrier against any future attempts to rewrite the narrative of what had happened to the young mother. The legal machinery had completed its work. The sentences were being served, and the public interest slowly drifted away toward new headlines, leaving behind only the permanent, quiet certainty that justice is not a matter of speed, but of an unyielding, systemic patience that will eventually break through any cover, no matter how holy, and bring the truth into the blinding light of day. The aftermath of the verdict in the scorching summer of 2027 didn't just dismantle the institutional facade of Christ Covenant Church, it completely flipped the psychological landscape of the Phoenix Valley, forcing a rapid, high-intensity audit of every hidden corner where power had historically bought silence. The realization that a silver-tongued cleric had spent 16 years delivering eulogies and blessing infants while holding the dark secrets of a desert grave shattered the community's trust in their own institutions. At Maricopa County headquarters, the case file labeled Lynn, Maya, 2010 was officially moved from the active homicide stacks into the permanent historical archives, but the work within the precinct was far from finished. Detectives found themselves swamped with a sudden, massive influx of secondary tips, an avalanche of cold case files, old missing persons reports, and forgotten reports of clerical misconduct that had been buried for decades under the weight of the church's multi-million-dollar corporate influence. The task force, exhausted but fueled by an explosive sense of momentum, treated the pastor's conviction not as a final destination, but as the initial breach in a massive dam of systemic corruption that had held the entire state of Arizona blind for an entire generation. Inside the clinical, fluorescent-lit corridors of the Digital Forensics Unit, technicians continued to dissect the recovered servers of the ministry, uncovering a highly organized network of data suppression that operated like a shadow intelligence agency within the suburbs. They discovered that whenever a parishioner had attempted to flag Miller's erratic, predatory patterns to local authorities in the early 2010s, the church's legal division had stepped in with aggressive non-disclosure agreements, financial settlements, and weaponized spiritual intimidation to neutralize the threat before it hit the police wire. This calculated suppression was the real monster behind the cold case, a corporate shield that had turned the Phoenix Police Department into unwitting accomplices by feeding them curated, manufactured alibis while Maya Lynn's family spent 16 years combing through the sun-baked arroyos of the valley. The exposure of this systemic cover-up triggered a series of late-night emergency sessions within the city council, resulting in a sweeping overhaul of how religious and nonprofit institutions are monitored under state law, proving that the legal legacy of the Lynn case would be written not just in prison sentences, but in the permanent restructuring of Arizona's institutional accountability. Meanwhile, the physical geography of Florence State Prison became the final, sterile container for a life that had been entirely constructed out of high-fidelity performance and predatory opportunism. Thomas Miller arrived at the maximum security complex stripped of his tailored Italian suits, his expensive luxury vehicles, and the adoring crowds that had once hung on his every syllable, his identity instantly reduced to a 6-digit inmate number stamped onto the back of a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The prison administration placed him in a high-security isolation wing to protect him from the general population, a move that accidentally granted the disgraced pastor the exact environment his actions had demanded, a silent, featureless concrete box where the only sound was the mechanical hum of the ventilation system and the distant, metallic slamming of cell doors. Reports from the correctional staff painted a portrait of a man who still attempted to maintain his holy composure, pacing the narrow grid of his cell while reciting passages of scripture to the blank walls, desperately trying to salvage his pastoral ego within the absolute vacuum of an enforced obscurity. There were no cameras to catch his micro-expressions, no microphones to amplify his rich baritone, and no faithful followers to offer him the drug of public validation. He was a phantom trapped in a monument of his own making, a man who had sought absolute cover and had finally been granted an absolute, suffocating isolation that would last for the rest of his natural life. Outside the prison walls, the Valley of Silence podcast team found themselves at the absolute center of a global conversation regarding the ethics and power of crowdsourced criminal justice, their production studio bombarded by major news networks and documentary filmmakers eager to commercialize the digital tip-off that had broken the 16-year stalemate. The show's host, remaining fiercely grounded despite the sudden wave of media notoriety, dedicated the final, uncut episode of the season to a raw, unvarnished exploration of the structural failures that allow predators like Miller to thrive in plain sight. The broadcast didn't celebrate the arrest as a triumphant media victory. Instead, it served as a dark, cautionary analytical piece on the dangers of collective blind faith, forcing listeners to question the cultural systems that elevate charismatic individuals above the baseline metrics of human decency. The anonymous female informant, whose 5-minute audio file remained the single most devastating piece of evidence in the state's arsenal, officially cut all ties with her former life, using the federal relocation program to vanish completely into a quiet, low-profile existence in New England. Her name and face permanently erased from the public record to ensure she would never become a target for the residual zealots of the collapsed ministry. The physical cleanup of Christ Covenant Church's massive asset base began in late winter, a public, highly visible liquidation process that felt like the deliberate dismantling of a modern pagan temple. The vast, glass-domed auditorium where Miller had delivered his final televised sermon was gutted by court-appointed auctioneers, its high-end soundboards, multi-angle cameras, and polished oak pews sold off to pay for the massive civil restitution judgments awarded to the Lynn estate. The sprawling suburban campus, once worth tens of millions of dollars, was purchased by a healthcare consortium with the explicit intent of converting the structure into a public children's medical facility, a profound, poetic transformation that ensured the ground once used to shield a predator would now be dedicated to the physical healing and preservation of the community's most vulnerable lives. The physical erasure of the church's branding from the Phoenix skyline was a visceral satisfaction for the residents of Maricopa County, a visual confirmation that the Holy Empire had fallen and that the soil had finally been cleansed of the toxic hypocrisy that had choked the valley for nearly 2 decades. For Maya Lynn's family, the true, quiet weight of the resolution unfolded far from the noise of the financial liquidations and public policy changes, settling into the familiar, deeply ordinary spaces of their modest suburban home. The missing person flyers that had occupied the front window since November 2010 were finally taken down, their edges brittle and yellowed by 16 years of relentless Arizona sun, leaving behind a clean, unobstructed view of the street where Maya had once played as a child. Her daughter, now an intelligent, quiet teenager who carried her mother's distinct, dark eyes, was finally able to step out from the long, exhausting shadow of the vanished mother narrative, her identity no longer defined by an unsolved internet mystery or a cold case file, but by the solid, unassailable reality of absolute legal vindication. The family created a small, private garden in their backyard, planting native desert flora that thrived in the heat, creating a sanctuary where they could sit in the quiet evening hours without the terror of the unknown, their grief having finally evolved from a sharp, screaming trauma into a soft, permanent monument of remembrance that belonged to them alone. The tactical and investigative divisions of the Phoenix Police Department underwent a massive, permanent shift in their operational culture, with the Lynn case analysis becoming a mandatory foundational module for all incoming homicide investigators and forensic scientists across the Southwest. The old, primitive assumption that a high social standing or a lack of criminal record could serve as an informal shield against deep surveillance was completely eradicated from the department's manual, replaced by a hyper-rigorous, data-first investigative protocol that mandates full cellular and financial tracking for all close associates within the first 48 hours of a disappearance. The heavy metal filing cabinets that had once held the stagnated case logs were systematically digitized, their contents fed into advanced machine learning networks designed to cross-reference geographical pings and historical vehicle registries, ensuring that the city would never again allow a cold case to calcify into an unsolvable urban legend simply because the investigators lacked the imagination or the technology to look behind the curtain of institutional respectability. As the desert night descended over the vast, pulsing grid of the Phoenix metropolitan area, the city lamps flickered to life one by one, cutting through the purple twilight and illuminating the long, straight avenues that stretched out toward the jagged mountain horizons. The air in the valley felt remarkably different now, cleared of the ambient, unspoken suspicion that had hung over the master-planned communities since the night Maya walked out of that diner kitchen. The story of her life had been successfully rescued from the cold, dead stasis of an unsolved mystery, its pages completed not by the violent hand of her hunter, but by the relentless, unyielding persistence of a community that had refused to let her name be forgotten. The legal machinery had ground to its final, absolute conclusion. The state prison cells were locked, and the media vans had moved on to other cities, leaving behind only the permanent, clean, and beautiful reality of a truth that had finally, after 16 long years of silence, broken through the desert earth to permanently claim the light. The deep, structural transformation of the Phoenix Valley as the calendar pushed past the summer of 2027 was not marked by sudden, dramatic eruptions, but by a heavy, chemical-like settling of the truth into the literal foundations of the city. The dust from the collapse of Christ Covenant Church had finally landed, leaving behind an empty, glass and steel skeleton on the suburban horizon that served as a daily, silent warning to every motorist on the interstate. At the Maricopa County Superior Courthouse, the digital monitors that had once flashed with the volatile, high-contrast images of the 2010 crime scene were dark, their data packets safely zipped and transferred into the deep, subterranean vaults of the state archive. The frantic, dawn-dap rhythm of the trial had been replaced by a clinical, historical stillness, a period where the city's legal and law enforcement apparatus began the heavy-duty work of turning a singular, shocking victory into a permanent, institutionalized standard of accountability. The task force had dissolved back into their respective divisions, but they carried with them the definitive, unshakable blueprint of the Lynn investigation, a case that had proven to an entire generation of Southwestern jurists that the passage of 16 years was completely irrelevant when confronted with the surgical, multi-layered precision of modern digital reconstruction. Inside the quiet, glass-walled offices of the newly formed Civilian Forensic Oversight Bureau, a direct, legislative consequence of the Valley of Silence podcast investigation, analysts began the systematic process of auditing how the state handled high-profile, institutionally protected suspects. The old, casual world of the mid-2010s, where a prominent citizen's alibi could be accepted on the basis of a handshake and a professional title, was completely dead, buried beneath the mountain of digital cell tower data that had dragged Reverend Thomas Miller from his pulpit to a maximum security isolation cell. Criminologists from across the country converged on Phoenix to study the Lynn metadata matrix, mapping out how a single, anonymous digital tip-off could be weaponized by an independent medium to bypass the bureaucratic bottlenecks that had historically allowed predatory individuals to purchase absolute immunity. The case had become a historic turning point in American jurisprudence, a masterclass in the democratization of justice that demonstrated how crowdsourced visibility and hyper-rigorous data tracking could work in a fluid, relentless symbiosis to force the state to reopen its most carefully guarded secrets. In the maximum security wing of the state correctional complex in Florence, Arizona, the environment remained entirely unchanged by the theoretical debates unfolding in the city's universities. For inmate 314982, formerly known as Reverend Thomas Miller, the world had shrunk to a permanent, immutable geometry of reinforced concrete and stainless steel, a space where the passage of the hot desert days was marked only by the mechanical shifting of shadows across his cell floor. The prison records, stripped of any pastoral honorifics, documented a subject who had completely entered a state of catatonic, defensive withdrawal, his once booming baritone reduced to a faint, erratic whisper that was occasionally picked up by the institutional audio logs during the midnight cell checks. He had been completely cut off from the drug of public adulation. There were no letters from faithful parishioners, no visits from the church elders who had once helped fund his high-priced legal shield, and no media cameras to capture the subtle, practiced micro-expressions of his calculated piety. The law had granted him an absolute, unyielding reflection of his own crime, an enforced, suffocating anonymity that mirrored the exact, terrifying isolation he had inflicted upon Maya Lynn in the dark alley behind the diner 16 years before. Outside the concrete perimeter of the penitentiary, the physical cleanup of the collapsed ministry's financial ruins reached its final, absolute liquidation phase, with the court-appointed receiver systematically distributing the remainder of the church's corporate wealth to the local advocacy centers that specialized in protecting vulnerable single mothers across Maricopa County. The multi-million-dollar suburban campus, stripped of its gold leaf signage and its high-definition broadcasting equipment, was officially handed over to the construction crews tasked with retrofitting the complex into the valley's largest public pediatric rehabilitation center. This physical conversion of the space was the ultimate, poetic victory for the residents of the neighborhood. The very ground that had once been utilized as a base of operations for a calculated, predatory deception was being systematically, structurally repurposed into a sanctuary of physical healing and transparent community service. The sight of the new, brightly colored medical signs replacing the old, imposing religious branding became a visual checkpoint for the drivers who had spent a generation passing that corner with a sense of ambient, unspoken dread, a tangible sign that the soil had finally been purged of its toxic hypocrisy. For the Lin family, the deepening winter of 2027 brought a profound, heavy-duty tranquility that existed entirely independent of the public reallocations and institutional overhauls taking place in the downtown plazas. The small, modest home on the edge of the grid had finally stopped being a site of frantic investigative activity or a target for true crime tourists. The news trucks had long since packed up their satellite dishes and moved on to other, fresher tragedies, leaving the front lawn to settle back into the quiet, mundane rhythms of the suburban block. Maya's mother spent her mornings in the small, private backyard garden they had built, tending to the native desert lavender and agave plants that thrived under the relentless Arizona sun, her face no longer carrying the sharp, defensive tension of a woman who was fighting a lonely, 16-year war against a silent valley. She had been granted the one thing that institutional corruption had tried to deny her for half a lifetime: the absolute, legal certainty of her daughter's vindication, an unassailable record of truth that allowed her to look at the photographs of Maya not with a sense of screaming, unresolved trauma, but with a soft, permanent, and beautifully quiet memory of love. Maya's daughter, now navigating the complex, intense landscape of late adolescence, moved through the school year with a newfound, structural confidence, her identity permanently liberated from the heavy, confusing narrative of the vanished mother that had haunted her childhood. She was no longer the subject of hushed, sympathetic whispers in the school corridors or the central figure in an unsolved internet mystery. She was simply herself, a young woman who carried her mother's striking, resilient dark eyes but whose future was entirely her own to design, unburdened by the dark, unresolved secrets of 2010. The family's internal healing was a silent, untelevised triumph that unfolded in the ordinary, everyday moments, the shared meals without the weight of an open question, the quiet evenings free from the terror of the desert horizon, and the steady, unhurried preparation for a future that was finally, absolutely guaranteed by the absolute finality of the law. The Homicide Division at the Phoenix Police Headquarters had completely finalized the integration of the Lin Protocol into their active training regimens, creating a hyper-rigorous, data-first baseline that transformed how all initial missing persons reports are processed within the state of Arizona. The historical failure of the 2010 task force, their willingness to accept a high-ranking social position or an institutional alibi as a reason to bypass basic cellular tracking and financial verification, was taught to incoming detectives as a catastrophic, cautionary lesson in systemic bias. The heavy metal filing cabinets that had once harbored the stagnated, yellowing logs of the cold case were empty, their digitized data fields now constantly scanned by automated cross-referencing networks that matched geographic anomalies against regional vehicle registries, ensuring that the city would never again allow a predator to construct an impenetrable fortress of respectability out of the community's blind faith. As the desert night descended over the vast, shimmering grid of the Phoenix metropolitan area, the city lamps cut through the cool, purple twilight, casting long, straight beams of light across the concrete avenues that stretched out toward the dark mountain silhouettes. The ambient air of the valley felt remarkably, permanently different, cleared of the heavy, suffocating weight of suspicion that had hung over the master-planned communities since the night Maya walked out of that diner kitchen. The story of her life had been successfully, definitively rescued from the cold stasis of the unsolved, its final chapters written not by the violent hand of her stalker, but by the relentless, data-driven persistence of a community that had refused to let her name be erased from the record of the living. The state prison cells were locked, the court orders were filed, and the city was moving forward into the evening, resting securely in the permanent, clean, and beautiful reality of a truth that had finally broken through the desert earth to claim the light forever. The transition into the 7th chapter of this long, multi-generational chronicle marks a period where the initial systemic shockwaves of the 2026 verdict have completely settled into the permanent, unyielding infrastructure of Arizona's judicial and cultural landscape. The year is transitioning, and the case of State versus Thomas Miller has officially ceased to be treated as a localized news sensation or a viral digital phenomenon, shifting instead into the quiet, unyielding territory of institutional memory and historical truth. The frantic, dawn-dap rhythm that once characterized the Valley of Silence podcast broadcasts and the explosive courtroom confrontations has been replaced by a deep, heavy-duty stillness, a period of structural stabilization where the city of Phoenix has begun the long, necessary work of turning a singular, historic victory into a permanent baseline of municipal accountability. The task force that executed the high-security takedown of the beloved local pastor has long since dissolved back into their respective specialized divisions, but they carried with them the definitive, unshakable blueprint of an investigation that proved to the entire Southwest that no amount of social capital, corporate wealth, or spiritual authority could outrun the long-range, data-driven persistence of modern cold case forensics. Inside the glass-paneled lecture halls of the Arizona Bureau of Investigation, the digital archives of the 2010 file have been fully integrated into the mandatory core curriculum for incoming homicide detectives, serving as the definitive master text on somatic hiding and institutional suppression. Young investigators, born long after the neon signs of the diner alleyway had been dismantled by suburban redevelopment, sit in the quiet multimedia rooms to analyze the Miller dossier, studying it not as a simple case of a predator in the suburbs, but as a complex, cautionary study in how an entire corporate ministry could actively subsidize the concealment of a monster to protect its financial brand and its social standing within Maricopa County. The focus of the training has completely shifted away from the old, reactive methods of policing toward a hyper-rigorous, data-first investigative protocol that mandates full cellular, financial, and geographical tracking for all close associates within the first 48 hours of a reported disappearance, ensuring that the department will never again allow an elite social standing or an institutional alibi to serve as an informal shield against deep surveillance. In the physical neighborhood where Maya Lin's life was so brutally interrupted, the landscape has achieved a state of profound, heavy-duty tranquility that has permanently overwritten the 16-year paranoid freeze that once held the master-planned communities hostage. The dark, abandoned structures that once lined the perimeter of the diner parking lot have been completely demolished by a city council initiative, replaced by a bright, well-lit pedestrian corridor designed specifically to eliminate the pockets of shadow that had harbored a predator in late 2010. The flickering street lamp beneath which her car keys had been found has been replaced by a permanent architectural light installation that illuminates a small, modern granite memorial, a marker that does not bear the name of the monster or detail the horror of his actions, but simply preserves Maya's name, her age, and her status as a mother whose memory has been successfully, definitively returned to the light of the valley. The path is now a constant, vibrant artery of human activity, filled with the ordinary, unhurried sounds of joggers, families walking dogs, and young commuters who move through the space with a sense of absolute security, a tangible sign that the soil has been permanently purged of its toxic hypocrisy. For the Lin family, the passage of these months has brought an internal, unassailable grace that exists entirely independent of the public overhauls and legislative transformations taking place in the downtown plazas. The small suburban home has ceased to be a target for true crime tourists or a site of frantic investigative updates. The news vans have long since packed up their satellite dishes and drifted away toward newer headlines, allowing the front lawn to settle back into the quiet, mundane rhythms of the residential block. Maya's mother spends her mornings tending to the native desert flora they planted in the backyard garden, her face no longer carrying the sharp, defensive tension of a woman who spent half a lifetime fighting a lonely war against a silent, indifferent valley. She's been granted the one thing that institutional corruption tried to deny her for 16 years, the absolute, legal certainty of her daughter's vindication, an unassailable record of truth that allows her to look at the photographs in the living room not with a sense of screaming, unresolved trauma, but with a soft, permanent, and beautifully quiet memory of love. Maya's daughter, now entering late adolescence with her mother's distinct, resilient dark eyes, moves through her daily life with a newfound structural confidence, her identity permanently liberated from the heavy, confusing narrative of the vanished mother that had haunted her childhood. She is no longer the subject of hushed, sympathetic whispers in the school corridors or the central figure in an unresolved internet mystery. She is simply herself, a young woman whose future is entirely her own to design, unburdened by the dark, unresolved secrets of 2010. The family's internal healing is a silent, untelevised triumph that unfolds in the ordinary, everyday moments, the shared meals without the weight of an open question, the quiet evenings free from the terror of the desert horizon, and the steady, unhurried preparation for a future that was finally, absolutely guaranteed by the absolute finality of the law. Inside the maximum security state facility in Florence, Arizona, the existence of inmate 314982, formerly known as Reverend Thomas Miller, has devolved into a complete, institutional silence, a living death where his name has been permanently stripped from the operational registers and replaced by a static string of administrative numbers. He is no longer monitored by the detectives who cracked his code, nor is he visited by the legal teams that once fought over the validity of his high-priced defense. He has been completely and permanently forgotten by the world outside the concrete walls, his life reduced to the narrow, unyielding, and silent routine of an isolation cell that mirrors the exact invisibility he once attempted to inflict upon Maya Lin. His long-running deception, which had once seemed so brilliant, so calculated, and so entirely impenetrable to the investigators of the 20th century, has been revealed by the relentless march of time to be nothing more than a hollow, self-inflicted trap that eventually clutched him in its teeth and dragged him into the light. He is a man who spent 40 years attempting to live a life that wasn't his, and the law has granted him exactly what his actions demanded, a permanent, absolute obscurity within the cold, concrete architecture of the state's ultimate retribution. As the late autumn sun sinks below the horizon, casting its long, amber fingers across the glass and steel towers of the Phoenix skyline, the city stands as a monumental testament to the idea that the truth is a living, breathing, and completely unstoppable force. The metropolis continues to grow, its transit lines expanding, its population shifting, and its old industrial boundaries being rewritten by the energy of a new generation. Yet beneath the surface of this relentless progress lies the unshakable foundation of justice that was poured during the trial of 2026. The story of Maya Lin has transitioned from a localized tragedy into a permanent part of the city's historical soul, a narrative that taught an entire community that even when the dark seems to have won, even when the silence spans across decades, and even when the mechanics of deceit are woven into the very fabric of institutional faith, the light will always find a way to penetrate the abyss. The physical evidence of the case, the cell tower logs, the Scottsdale garage ledgers, the internal church memos, and the digital files of the Valley of Silence remains safely secured in the central vaults of the courthouse, a pristine collection of historical data that is no longer needed to prove a point, but is preserved as a sacred archive of a community's refusal to let a child be forgotten. The files are cold, the investigation is complete, and the legal machinery has fallen silent, leaving behind only the clean, unburdened space of a reality that has been fully restored to the light. The final act of this sprawling human epic is the simple, beautiful, and utterly ordinary sight of the city moving forward into the evening, its lights illuminating the streets, the parks, and the paths where a girl once walked into the night, and where a city finally, after 16 years of waiting, brought her memory permanently, safely, and beautifully home to stay. The transition into the 8th chapter of this multi-generational chronicle marks the moment where the profound legislative and structural overhauls triggered by the Thomas Miller verdict begin to harden into permanent, unyielding pillars of Arizona's criminal justice system. By the late months of 2027, the initial, chaotic public energy surrounding the downfall of Christ Covenant Church has been completely replaced by a clinical, institutional focus on systemic continuity. The case of Maya Lin has officially evolved from an isolated tragedy of the Valley into the legal and investigative benchmark known across the American Southwest as the Lin Standard. This new administrative protocol completely eliminates the old, subjective reliance on local influence and high social status during the critical first 48 hours of a missing person investigation, replacing it with an automatic, high-intensity deployment of digital forensics, real-time cellular data analysis, and exhaustive financial auditing that leaves no room for corporate or institutional suppression. At the heart of downtown Phoenix, the newly established Civilian Forensic Oversight Bureau has expanded its operations, occupying a state-of-the-art facility that functions as a high-technology tracking center for unresolved cold cases. The archives of the 2010 investigation have been completely digitized and cross-referenced with a massive, regional data grid that automatically tracks geographical anomalies, vehicle registry shifts, and mobile sector handoffs from the pre-digital era. Young data analysts and incoming homicide investigators sit side by side in glass-paneled workstations, utilizing the precise metadata matrix developed during the Valley of Silence Task Force operation to scan old files for the subtle, microscopic digital footprints that predatory individuals once used to purchase absolute anonymity. The historic success of the Lin resolution has proven to the entire Maricopa County administration that time is not a barrier to justice, but rather a terrain of data that, if maintained with surgical precision, will eventually expose the most carefully constructed deceptions. In the physical landscape of the Valley, the physical liquidation of the collapsed ministry's holdings has reached a stage of structural permanence that has completely rewritten the suburban skyline. The massive, glass-domed megacomplex that once housed Miller's weekly televised sermons has been completely gutted and retrofitted by a regional healthcare consortium into the Valley's largest public pediatric rehabilitation and family resource center. The imposing, corporate religious branding that had stood for nearly 2 decades as a visual symbol of institutional dominance has been entirely replaced by bright, welcoming medical signs, transforming a site once used to harbor a predator into a sanctuary of physical healing and transparent public service. The neighborhood residents, who had spent 16 years passing that corner with a lingering sense of ambient, unspoken dread, now view the space as a testament to the community's collective resilience, a physical proof that the soil has been permanently purged of its toxic hypocrisy. The pedestrian corridor built behind the old strip mall where Maya Lin walked her final shift has matured into a vibrant, highly integrated artery of the local community, its design engineered specifically to banish the dark pockets of shadow that had existed in late 2010. The modern, high-intensity lighting installation that replaces the old, flickering street lamp casts a constant, protective glow over the small granite memorial marker that sits at the center of the walkway. On any given evening, the path is filled with the unhurried, ordinary sounds of human life, joggers navigating the grid, families walking through the green spaces, and students from the nearby campus utilizing the stone benches to study under the clear desert sky. The location has been entirely reclaimed from its predatory history, its memory preserved not as a monument to the monster who stalked the alleyways, but as a permanent, dignified tribute to a young mother whose name was successfully and permanently rescued from the stasis of the dark. For the Lin family, the deepening winter brings a profound, heavy-duty tranquility that exists entirely far from the noise of public policy changes and corporate liquidations. The modest suburban home has completely ceased to be a point of public curiosity or an investigative site. The true crime tourists and media vans have long since vanished from the block, allowing the front yard to settle back into the quiet, ordinary rhythm of the residential neighborhood. Maya's mother spends her quiet morning hours tending to the desert lavender and native agave plants in the backyard sanctuary, her posture completely free of the sharp, defensive tension that had characterized her existence during the 16-year war for her daughter's memory. She now possesses the one thing that institutional corruption attempted to deny her for half a lifetime: the absolute, unassailable legal record of the truth, an immutable vindication that allows her to look at the photographs in the living room with a soft, peaceful memory of love rather than the screaming, unresolved trauma of the unknown. Maya's daughter has transitioned into the complex world of late adolescence with a newfound structural confidence, her personal identity permanently liberated from the heavy, suffocating narrative of the vanished mother that had haunted her entire childhood. She is no longer the central subject of hushed, sympathetic whispers in the school corridors or the primary figure in an unresolved internet mystery. She is simply herself, a young woman who carries her mother's distinct, resilient dark eyes but whose future is entirely her own to design, unburdened by the dark, toxic secrets of 2010. The internal healing of the family is a quiet, untelevised triumph that unfolds entirely in the ordinary, everyday moments, the shared family meals without the crushing weight of an open question, the quiet evenings free from the terror of the shifting desert horizons, and the steady, unhurried preparation for a life that is finally, absolutely guaranteed by the absolute finality of the law. Inside the maximum security state facility in Florence, Arizona, the existence of inmate 314982, formerly known to thousands as Reverend Thomas Miller, has settled into a state of total institutional oblivion. He exists within the reinforced concrete walls not as a figure of controversy or public intrigue, but as a non-entity, a static, six-digit identifier in the state prison registry whose presence is completely irrelevant to the forward-moving reality of the world outside. The prison records document a subject who has completely entered a state of permanent, defensive withdrawal, his once booming baritone reduced to a faint, erratic mutter that is occasionally logged by the automated audio surveillance during the routine midnight cell inspections. The law has granted him the exact, unyielding reflection of his own crime, an absolute, permanent, and suffocating anonymity within the concrete grid of the state's ultimate containment, an isolation that mirrors the exact invisibility he once inflicted upon Maya Lin in the dark alley behind the diner. As the late autumn sun sinks behind the jagged mountain silhouettes, casting its long, amber fingers across the glass and steel high-rises of the Phoenix skyline, the city stands as a monumental proof that the truth is a living, breathing, and completely unstoppable current. The vast metropolis continues to expand its boundaries, its light rail lines cutting through the desert grid, its population shifting, and its old commercial corridors being rewritten by the energy of a new generation. Yet beneath the surface of this relentless progress lies the unshakable foundation of justice that was poured during the historic trial of 2026. The story of Maya Lin has transitioned completely from a localized tragedy into a permanent part of the city's historical soul, a narrative that reminds every citizen that even when the dark seems to have won, even when the silence spans across decades, and even when the mechanics of deceit are woven into the very fabric of institutional faith, the light will always find a way to penetrate the abyss. The physical artifacts of the long struggle, the cell tower logs, the Scottsdale garage ledgers, the internal church memos, and the high-resolution forensic digital files remain safely secured in the central vaults of the Maricopa County Courthouse, a pristine archive of historical truth that is no longer needed to prove a point, but is preserved as a sacred record of a community's refusal to let a child be forgotten. The files are cold, the investigation is complete, and the legal machinery has fallen silent, leaving behind only the clean, unburdened space of a reality that has been fully and permanently restored to the light. The final act of this sprawling human epic is the simple, beautiful, and utterly ordinary sight of the city moving forward into the evening, its lamps flickering to life one by one, illuminating the avenues, the parks, and the paths where a girl once walked into the night, and where a city finally, after 16 years of waiting, brought her memory safely and permanently home to stay. The transition into the 9th chapter of this expansive human chronicle marks a period where the structural, legislative, and technological updates triggered by the case of State versus Thomas Miller have completely solidified, integrating the memory of the 2010 tragedy into the progressive, data-driven identity of the modern Phoenix metropolis. The year has shifted the event further away from the immediate, visceral shockwaves of the courtroom into the quiet, unyielding territory of historical truth, forcing the city to view its own development through the lens of institutional memory and forensic accountability. The Civilian Forensic Oversight Bureau, now operating at the absolute height of its administrative and analytical capabilities, has successfully cleared the vast backlog of pre-digital cold cases that had long compromised Maricopa County's moral integrity, transforming the valley from a location once haunted by unresolved disappearances into a national sanctuary for the preservation of personal identity. The name Maya Lin is no longer spoken of by local media outlets with the breathless, predatory sensationalism of the true crime genre. Instead, it has been enshrined as the foundational catalyst for a legal and scientific revolution that fundamentally altered the relationship between state justice and human time. The high-definition digital repositories of the 2010 investigation have become the standard reference material for international forensic symposia, with criminologists from across the country traveling to the Phoenix Institute to study the Lin metadata matrix, the specific methodology that fuses advanced historical cellular tracking with deep, longitudinal social tracing to eliminate corporate and institutional identity shields. The case has proven to the global law enforcement community that the passage of nearly 2 decades does not dilute the efficacy of circumstantial metadata, provided that the initial recovery of cell tower logs and carrier archives was conducted with an eye toward future analytical capabilities. The single, discarded mobile device registry that had remained frozen in the darkness of a carrier data vault for 16 years is now celebrated as the ultimate symbol of forensic patience, a digital footprint that held the line against the total erasure of a human life until the technology of the 21st century could finally catch up to the scale of the deception. In the suburban landscape where the crime occurred, the physical remnants of the 2010 environment have been completely transformed by the continuous, vibrant expansion of the city, yet the memory of Maya remains carefully, elegantly preserved within the architectural layout of the modern neighborhood. The historical sanctuary that replaced the old strip mall structures has matured into a lush, thriving urban pathway, its modern lighting systems and open-air design providing a protective shield over the corridors that were once the exclusive territory of a community-wide paranoid freeze. The Stone and Timber Pedestrian Pavilion has become a focal point for the city's civic community, a space where local residents gather to interact under the clear desert sky, unwittingly fulfilling the social and human potential that was stolen from Maya on that mid-November night. The transformation of the soil is absolute. The location has been entirely purged of its predatory history, its space reclaimed not by the silence of a hidden sin, but by the continuous, noisy, and beautiful manifestation of human life in the present. For the Lin family, the passage of this 9th phase has deepened their state of quiet, unassailable grace, a profound internal settling that has allowed them to completely disconnect their current lives from the historical trauma that once held them hostage. They have successfully negotiated the transition from being the public victims of an unresolved horror to being private citizens whose quiet contribution to the moral spine of Atlanta and Phoenix is universally acknowledged and respected by every tier of local society. They no longer feel the defensive need to protect Maya's memory from the distortions of public curiosity, because the truth has been set into the unassailable, permanent record of the state, providing them with an unbreakable shield against the world's scrutiny. They live their days in the quiet, mundane comfort of a home that is finally free of ghosts, their interactions characterized by the simple, necessary joy of watching the next generation grow up in a city that is fundamentally safer, more transparent, and more humane because of the 16-year struggle they had the courage to endure. Mark Miller's continuous, entirely anonymous patronage of genetic and forensic research from his remote sanctuary in the Pacific Northwest has quietly revolutionized the field of missing persons advocacy on a national scale. The grants he established using the entirety of his family's contaminated inheritance have funded the resolution of dozens of cold cases across the country, providing lower-income families with the expensive, high-level technological tracking that was once the exclusive domain of high-profile investigations. He has lived his life in a state of absolute, meditative detachment from the geography of his brother's crime, his daily routines defined by the quiet, rhythmic pulse of the ocean, and the internal knowledge that he has successfully purged his bloodline of the parasitic darkness that once sought to use his face as an instrument of terror. He has become an invisible force for good in the world, a man who sought no praise, no recognition, and no historical legacy, content to let the quiet resolution of other families' grief serve as his final, personal monument of atonement. Inside the maximum security state facility in Florence, Arizona, the existence of inmate 314982, formerly known to thousands as Reverend Thomas Miller, has devolved into a complete, institutional silence, a state of living death where his name has been permanently replaced by a series of digits in the administrative registry. He is no longer monitored by the detectives who cracked the case, nor is he visited by the legal teams that once fought over the validity of his defense. He has been completely forgotten by the world outside the walls, his life reduced to the narrow, unyielding, and silent routine of an isolation cell. His long-running deception, which had once seemed so brilliant, so calculated, and so entirely impenetrable, has been revealed by the relentless march of time to be nothing more than a hollow, self-inflicted trap that eventually clutched him in its teeth and dragged him into the light. He is a man who spent 40 years trying to live a life that wasn't his, and the law has granted him exactly what his actions demanded, a permanent, absolute obscurity within the cold, concrete architecture of the state's ultimate retribution. As the late summer twilight fades over the vast, sparkling expanse of the Phoenix metropolitan area, the city stands as a monumental proof that nothing is ever truly lost to the darkness if a community possesses the courage and the persistence to keep looking into its own past. The skyscrapers of the business district, the sprawling networks of the transit system, and the vibrant, diverse neighborhoods that house millions of souls all move forward into the future with a sense of security that was bought at a tremendous, generational cost. The story of Maya Lin has transitioned from a localized tragedy into a permanent, guiding myth for the city's soul, a narrative that reminds every citizen that justice is not a static concept or a historical luxury, but a living, breathing, and completely unstoppable current that will eventually find its way into the deepest abyss of human deception. The physical evidence of the case, the cell tower logs, the Scottsdale garage ledgers, the internal church memos, and the high-resolution forensic digital files, remains safely secured in the central vaults of the courthouse, a pristine collection of historical data that is no longer needed to prove a point, but is preserved as a sacred archive of a community's refusal to let a child be forgotten. The files are cold, the investigation is complete, and the legal machinery has fallen silent, leaving behind only the clean, unburdened space of a reality that has been fully restored to the light. The final act of this sprawling human epic is the simple, beautiful, and utterly ordinary sight of the city moving forward into the evening, its lights illuminating the streets, the parks, and the paths where a girl once walked into the night, and where a city finally, after 16 years of waiting, brought her memory permanently, safely, and beautifully home to stay. The unfolding of the 10th chapter in this monumental, generational chronicle brings the valley to the precise edge of a new era, a time where the transformative systems established in the immediate wake of the 2026 verdict have completely solidified into the permanent, unyielding infrastructure of modern civic life. The passage of these 10 long, reflective years has effectively cleansed the municipal consciousness of the raw, erratic sensationalism that once surrounded the downfall of the church empire, allowing the story of Maya Lin to settle into its rightful, permanent place as the foundational myth of the city's forensic and ethical rebirth. The Civilian Forensic Oversight Bureau, which began as a desperate, experimental response to an institutional shield, has now matured into an internationally renowned institute, a sleek, architectural marvel of glass and steel that sits on the edge of the downtown grid, housing the most advanced data processing networks in the hemisphere. The name of the victim is no longer utilized by local media outlets as a commercial hook for sensationalized true crime broadcasting. It has been etched into the literal stone of the city's legal history, representing the exact moment when the state of Arizona declared that time would no longer serve as a sanctuary for those who commit crimes against the collective soul of the community. The pristine, high-definition digital databases of the 2010 file have become a mandatory, universally studied diagnostic tool for law enforcement agencies spanning from federal bureaus to international coalitions, with criminalists and behavioral analysts analyzing the Thomas Miller dossier as the definitive text on somatic hiding and corporate-backed data suppression. The case has permanently dismantled the archaic 20th century assumption that a prominent citizen's alibi or a multi-million-dollar religious organization could automatically create an unprosecutable pocket of reasonable doubt through the strategic manipulation of community trust. The single, discarded mobile device registry that had remained frozen in the darkness of a carrier data vault for 16 years is now celebrated within the Institute's historical wing as a silent, shimmering monument to forensic patience, a digital footprint that held the line against the total, permanent erasure of a human life until the arrival of an era that possessed the technological eyes capable of reading its secrets and executing its justice. In the physical neighborhood where the crime occurred, the landscape has achieved a state of deep, heavy-duty serenity that has permanently overwritten the suburban dread of the late 20th century. The dark, abandoned structures that once formed a terrifying barrier around the diner parking lot have been completely transformed by a city council initiative into a flourishing, open-air historical sanctuary and pedestrian transit zone. The specific coordinates where Maya's life was so brutally interrupted have been entirely replaced by an elegant, open-frame architectural pavilion built from local granite and white timber, a design specifically engineered to channel the blinding Arizona sunlight into the very spaces that were once defined by absolute, suffocating darkness. The paths are no longer walked with the quick, panic strides of parents looking over their shoulders. They are populated by a continuous, vibrant stream of joggers, families, and young students from the nearby campus who sit upon the stone benches to study, completely unburdened by the history of the dirt beneath them because the mystery has been stripped of its power to terrify. The brass plates that trace the winding walkways do not mention the mechanics of the abduction or state the name of the monster who inhabited the shadows. Instead, they are permanently inscribed with the personal notes Maya left behind, the milestones of her childhood, and the testimonies of the friends who remember her not as a tragic headline, but as a brilliant, resilient presence who once filled the valley with life. For the Lin family, the arrival of this 10th year of absolute resolution has brought a form of emotional finality that is as solid as it is quiet, a profound internal settling that has allowed them to completely separate their current existence from the historical trauma that once held them hostage. They have successfully negotiated the difficult, painful transition from being the public victims of an unresolved horror to being private citizens whose quiet contribution to the moral spine of the valley is universally recognized and respected by every tier of local society. They no longer feel the defensive need to protect Maya's memory from the distortions of public curiosity, because the truth has been set into the unassailable, permanent record of the state, providing them with an unbreakable shield against the world's scrutiny. They live their remaining days in the quiet, mundane comfort of a home that is finally, absolutely free of ghosts, their interactions characterized by the simple, necessary joy of watching the next generation of their family grow up in a city that is fundamentally safer, more transparent, and more humane because of the 16-year struggle they had the courage to endure. The continuous, entirely anonymous patronage of genetic and forensic research conducted by Mark Miller from his isolated coastal sanctuary in the Pacific Northwest has quietly, fundamentally revolutionized the field of missing persons advocacy on a global scale. The independent research grants he established using the entirety of his family's contaminated inheritance have directly funded the forensic excavation and resolution of dozens of long-term cold cases across the continental United States, providing lower-income families with the expensive, high-level technological tracking that was once the exclusive luxury of high-profile, politically sensitive investigations. He has lived his life in a state of absolute, meditative detachment from the physical geography of his brother's crime, his daily routines defined by the rhythmic, cold pulse of the ocean and the internal knowledge that he has successfully, permanently purged his bloodline of the parasitic darkness that once sought to use his face as a cloaking device for murder. He has become an invisible, legendary force for good within the forensic community, a man who sought no praise, no recognition, and no historical legacy, content to let the quiet, untelevised resolution of other families' grief serve as his final, personal monument of historical atonement. Inside the sterile, maximum security state facility in Florence, Arizona, the existence of inmate 314982, formerly known to thousands as Reverend Thomas Miller, has devolved into a state of total, institutional oblivion, a living death where his name has been completely erased from the operational registers and replaced by a static string of administrative numbers. He is no longer monitored by the detectives who cracked his code, nor is he visited by the legal teams that once argued over the validity of his defense. He has been completely forgotten by the world outside the concrete walls, his life reduced to the narrow, unyielding, and silent routine of an isolation cell. His long-running deception, which had once seemed so brilliant, so calculated, and so entirely impenetrable, has been revealed by the relentless march of time to be nothing more than a hollow, self-inflicted trap that eventually clutched him in its teeth and dragged him into the light. He is a man who spent 40 years attempting to live a life that wasn't his, and the law has granted him exactly what his actions demanded, a permanent, absolute obscurity within the cold, concrete architecture of the state's ultimate retribution. As the late summer twilight fades over the vast, sparkling expanse of the modern Phoenix metropolitan area, the city stands as a monumental proof that nothing is ever truly lost to the darkness if a community possesses the courage, the resources, and the stubborn persistence to keep looking into its own past. The skyscrapers of the business district, the sprawling networks of the transit system, and the vibrant, diverse neighborhoods that house millions of souls all move forward into the future with a sense of structural security that was bought at a tremendous, generational cost. The story of Maya Lin has transitioned from a localized tragedy into a permanent, guiding myth for the city's soul, a narrative that reminds every citizen that justice is not a static concept or a historical luxury, but a living, breathing, and completely unstoppable current that will eventually find its way into the deepest, most carefully guarded abyss. The physical evidence of the case, the cell tower logs, the Scottsdale garage ledgers, the internal church memos, and the high-resolution forensic digital files remains safely secured in the central vaults of the courthouse, a pristine collection of historical data that is no longer needed to prove a point, but is preserved as a sacred archive of a community's refusal to let a child be forgotten. The files are cold, the investigation is complete, and the legal machinery has fallen silent, leaving behind only the clean, unburdened space of a reality that has been fully restored to the light. The final act of this sprawling human epic is the simple, beautiful, and utterly ordinary sight of the city moving forward into the evening, its lights illuminating the streets, the parks, and the paths where a girl once walked into the night, and where a city finally, after 16 years of waiting, brought her memory permanently, safely, and beautifully home to stay. The grand, sweeping architecture of the Phoenix forensic apparatus stands today not merely as a network of labs and servers, but as the literal structural blueprint for a city that finally chose to stop outrunning its historical trauma. As the 10th year of the post-verdict era transitions into the quiet permanence of an established decade, the case of State versus Thomas Miller has shed its final layers of localized, true crime sensationalism, hardening into a monolithic landmark of structural justice. The Civilian Forensic Oversight Bureau, which began its life as an experimental, high-intensity response to institutional data suppression, now sits at the very heart of the state's legal infrastructure, its glass and steel tower reflecting the clean desert sky while housing computational arrays that scan the pre-digital records of Maricopa County with relentless, mechanical precision. The name Maya Lin is no longer spoken of in the Dawn Dap, predatory cadences of immediate news flashes or investigative audio waves. It has become an unassailable baseline, a permanent civic monument that reminds every citizen that time is no longer a sanctuary for those who operate in the dark, and that an elite social status is entirely useless when confronted with a surgical, long-range persistence of data-driven reconstruction. The technical logs of the 2010 investigation, once a chaotic, fragmented pile of dead-end alibis and forgotten cellular pings, have been completely codified into the standard diagnostic manuals used by federal law enforcement academies across the nation under the definitive label of the Lynn paradigm. This methodology has permanently dismantled the archaic assumptions of the early 21st century, proving that a multi-million-dollar religious organization or a highly curated public image cannot create an impenetrable pocket of reasonable doubt if the metadata of a suspect's movements can be laid across a digital grid with mathematical finality. The carrier network logs that remained frozen in the darkness of an enterprise data vault for 16 long years are now studied as a masterclass in forensic endurance, a glowing digital trail that held the line against the absolute erasure of a single mother's life until the technology of a future generation could develop the sharp, analytical eyes necessary to read its secrets and execute its justice. In the suburban neighborhood where the abduction took place, the physical space has achieved a state of deep, heavy-duty tranquility that has permanently overwritten the 16-year paranoid freeze that once held the cul-de-sacs hostage. The dark alleys and abandoned commercial structures that had harbored a predator in late 2010 have been entirely replaced by an open-air historical sanctuary and well-lit pedestrian artery, its architectural pavilion constructed from local granite and white timber to channel the bright Arizona sun into the exact coordinates where the vacuum had once been created. The paths are no longer navigated with the tense, hurried strides of families looking over their shoulders. They are filled with a continuous, vibrant stream of joggers, commuters, and young students from the nearby campus who utilize the granite benches to study beneath the clear sky, completely unburdened by the history of the soil because the mystery has been stripped of its power to terrify. The brass markers embedded along the walkways do not mention the mechanics of the violence or record the name of the cleric who hid behind the altar. Instead, they are permanently inscribed with the personal milestones of Maya's life, her childhood aspirations, and the words of the friends who remember her as a brilliant, resilient presence who once filled the valley with light. For the Lynn family, the deepening finality of this 10th milestone has brought an internal, unassailable grace that exists entirely far from the noise of public policy modifications or the structural liquidations of the collapsed ministry. The modest home on the edge of the grid has ceased to be a target for media exploitation or public curiosity. The news trucks have long since unpacked their satellite dishes and drifted away toward fresher headlines, allowing the front lawn to settle back into the quiet, ordinary rhythms of the block. Maya's mother spends her quiet morning hours tending to the native desert flora in their backyard sanctuary, her posture completely free of the sharp, defensive tension that had characterized her existence during her half-lifetime war against a silent, indifferent valley. She now possesses the one thing that institutional corruption attempted to deny her for 16 years, the absolute, unassailable legal record of the truth, an immutable vindication that allows her to look at the photographs in the living room with a soft, peaceful memory of love rather than the screaming, unresolved trauma of an open question. Maya's daughter has transitioned into adulthood with a newfound structural confidence, her personal identity permanently liberated from the heavy, suffocating narrative of the vanished mother that had haunted her entire childhood. She is no longer the central subject of hushed, sympathetic whispers in the school corridors or the primary figure in an unresolved internet mystery. She is simply herself, a young woman who carries her mother's distinct, resilient dark eyes but whose future is entirely her own to design, unburdened by the dark, toxic secrets of 2010. The internal healing of the family is a silent, untelevised triumph that unfolds entirely in the ordinary, everyday moments, the shared family meals without the crushing weight of a mystery, the quiet evenings free from the terror of the shifting desert horizons, and the steady, unhurried preparation for a life that is finally, absolutely guaranteed by the absolute finality of the law. Inside the maximum security state facility in Florence, Arizona, the existence of inmate 314982, formerly known to thousands as Reverend Thomas Miller, has settled into a state of total, institutional oblivion. He exists within the reinforced concrete walls not as a figure of controversy or public intrigue, but as a non-entity, a static, 6-digit identifier in the state prison registry whose presence is completely irrelevant to the forward-moving reality of the world outside. The prison records document a subject who has completely entered a state of permanent, catatonic withdrawal, his once booming baritone reduced to a faint, erratic mutter that is occasionally logged by the automated audio surveillance during the routine midnight cell inspections. The law has granted him the exact, unyielding reflection of his own crime, an absolute, permanent, and suffocating anonymity within the concrete grid of the state's ultimate containment, an isolation that mirrors the exact invisibility he once inflicted upon Maya Lin in the dark alley behind the diner. As the late summer sun sinks behind the jagged mountain silhouettes, casting its long, amber fingers across the glass and steel high-rises of the Phoenix skyline, the city stands as a monumental proof that the truth is a living, breathing, and completely unstoppable current. The vast metropolis continues to expand its boundaries, its light rail lines cutting through the desert grid, its population shifting, and its old commercial corridors being rewritten by the energy of a new generation. Yet beneath the surface of this relentless progress lies the unshakable foundation of justice that was poured during the historic trial of 2026. The story of Maya Lin has transitioned completely from a localized tragedy into a permanent part of the city's historical soul, a narrative that reminds every citizen that even when the dark seems to have won, even when the silence spans across decades, and even when the mechanics of deceit are woven into the very fabric of institutional faith, the light will always find a way to penetrate the abyss. The physical artifacts of the long struggle, the cell tower logs, the Scottsdale garage ledgers, the internal church memos, and the high-resolution forensic digital files remain safely secured in the central vaults of the Maricopa County Courthouse, a pristine archive of historical truth that is no longer needed to prove a point, but is preserved as a sacred record of a community's refusal to let a child be forgotten. The files are cold, the investigation is complete, and the legal machinery has fallen silent, leaving behind only the clean, unburdened space of a reality that has been fully and permanently restored to the light. The final act of this sprawling human epic is the simple, beautiful, and utterly ordinary sight of the city moving forward into the evening, its lamps flickering to life one by one, illuminating the avenues, the parks, and the paths where a girl once walked into the night, and where a city finally, after 16 years of waiting, brought her memory safely and permanently home to stay. The case is closed, the record is absolute, and the valley is finally completely free. The completion of that 10th milestone did not cause the narrative to grind to a sudden, structural halt. Rather, it signaled the exact transition where the case of Maya Lin ascended completely from the realm of operational law enforcement into the permanent, unyielding architecture of the valley's timeless conscience. As the late 2030s stretch out across the vast, sun-baked grid of Maricopa County, the systemic legacy of the 2010 resolution has ceased to be debated as a modern anomaly, settling instead into the literal bedrock of the American Southwest as a definitive cultural truth, a permanent warning to those who believe that the passage of time can erode the state's capacity for technological and forensic reclamation. Phoenix, a metropolis that spent the better half of the last century expanding outward in a frantic, concrete attempt to outrun its own unexamined histories, has grown into a collective consciousness that treats the preservation of individual identity not as a bureaucratic luxury, but as the core, moral justification of its municipal existence. The Civilian Forensic Oversight Bureau, housed within its permanent headquarters of reflective glass and native Arizona granite, has successfully integrated its predictive metadata models with a deep, multi-generational digital archive, ensuring that the historical blind spots, where a human being could once be violently erased, have been entirely eliminated by a system operating under the absolute assumption that every citizen has an unassailable right to be permanently seen, recorded, and protected across the span of human time. The historical sanctuary, which grew organically from the soil where the dark alleyways and old strip malls once stood, has achieved a state of profound ecological and social maturity, its sprawling canopy of desert trees providing a protective shield over a landscape that was once defined by the paralyzing silence of a 16-year paranoid freeze. The stone and timber pavilion erected at the precise coordinates of the 2010 abduction has become the uncontested heart of the neighborhood's daily existence, a space where the total transparency of the design, with its open-air walkways, glass meeting rooms, and ungated garden beds, stands as a constant, structural rebuttal to the era of the hidden secret. On any given midsummer evening, the ambient air is filled not with the tense, frantic whispers of a community looking over its shoulder, but with the steady, vibrant, and incredibly diverse sounds of a new generation of Phoenix residents who gather to play music, study, and walk through the green spaces along paths that have been completely cleared of their predatory energy. The transformation of the space is absolute. The location has been entirely purged of its predatory history, its earth reclaimed from the isolation of an unpunished sin and turned over to the continuous, beautiful, and beautifully mundane manifestation of human life in the present. For the Lin family, the passage into this final, permanent status of resolution has brought a form of peace that is remarkably, beautifully devoid of the performative closures demanded by the modern media apparatus. They have successfully outlived the era of their own exploitation, transitioning from the public faces of an agonizing, 16-year void into private citizens whose quiet, stubborn resilience is woven directly into the ethical fabric of the community. The family home, which for nearly 2 decades stood